I walked into divorce court ready to lose everything. My cheating husband wanted the house, the company, and even my car. He told the judge the kids were mine to keep because they did not fit his executive lifestyle. My own mother whispered for me to give him everything. So I did. His wealthy family laughed out loud in the courtroom, celebrating their total victory over a middle-class nobody. They had no idea the stack of papers they just forced me to sign was actually a federal trap that would send them all straight to prison. My name is Gwen, 33 years old, and a certified fraud examiner. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever let toxic people think they won just before you pulled the rug out from under them. The heavy oak doors of the family court of Cook County sealed shut behind me, trapping me in a room that smelled of stale floor wax and impending ruin. I sat perfectly still at the long mahogany table. According to the people sitting across from me, my life was officially over. Let us stop wasting the time of this court, Gwen. Derek's voice boomed across the room. Derek was my soon-to-be ex-brother-in-law. He was an ambitious African-American corporate attorney who knew exactly how to weaponize his presence. He adjusted the cuffs of his expensive tailored suit and leaned forward, his dark eyes locking onto mine with absolute disdain. He spoke to me as if I were a slow child who had wandered into a boardroom. "My client, your husband, is offering a clean break," Derek said smoothly. "He assumes full ownership of Apex Innovations, LLC. He retains the primary residence in Highland Park and the Porsche Macan. In exchange, he will not pursue you for alimony, despite the fact that you have been functionally useless to the growth of the company for the past 2 years." I did not look at Derek. I looked at Preston. Preston was 35 years old and styled himself as a visionary tech founder. Right now, he sat with his arms crossed, checking his gold Rolex. He did not even have the decency to look me in the eye during our divorce hearing. He was too busy texting. I knew exactly who was on the receiving end of those texts. It was Kelsey, the 24-year-old Pilates instructor he had been funneling company money to for the past 9 months. "What about the children?" I asked, keeping my voice entirely flat, completely devoid of the hysterical tears they were so desperately hoping to see. Preston sighed dramatically and finally looked up from his glowing screen. "The kids are yours to keep, Gwen. Let us be real here. Children are an anchor. I am scaling a multi-million-dollar enterprise. I cannot be pausing investor meetings to deal with parent-teacher conferences. I will take every other weekend but no overnight stays until they are older. It disrupts my workflow. Yours to keep." He spoke about our 7-year-old son and 5-year-old daughter like they were defective office furniture he was leaving behind in a warehouse move. A sharp, mocking laugh echoed from the spectator gallery right behind Preston. It was Beatrice, my 62-year-old mother-in-law. She crossed her legs and smoothed her designer skirt, making sure everyone in the room paid attention to her. "Oh, please, Preston, do not pretend she actually wants the children," Beatrice sneered, projecting her voice loud enough for the court stenographer to record. "She is just trying to figure out how to leverage them for a larger payout. Look at her. A glorified calculator, a number cruncher. She never fit into our world. Sign the papers, Gwen. Go back to your middle-class misery and let my son build his empire." I felt a sharp, painful pinch on my right thigh. I flinched and turned my head. My own mother, Martha, was sitting next to me. She was 60 years old and had insisted on coming today, claiming she wanted to support me. But all she had done since we walked into the building was emit a frequency of pure anxiety and submission. "Gwen, stop this!" Martha hissed, her voice trembling. She leaned in close, her breath smelling of peppermint and fear. "Just sign it. Give him everything. We do not have the money to fight Derek in court. The legal fees will bankrupt us. You should not have snooped into his business accounts in the first place. Men have needs. Men get stressed. Now you have ruined your marriage over a little fling and you are dragging me into this humiliation. Just sign the damn papers." I stared at my mother. She had spent my entire life terrified of anyone with a slightly higher tax bracket. She wanted me to surrender my life's work just so she would not have to feel uncomfortable around wealthy people. "I am not dragging you into anything, Mother." I whispered coldly. You can leave right now if the truth makes you nauseous. I am trying to protect you. Martha Whisper shouted, tears welling in her eyes, deploying her ultimate weapon of passive-aggressive parenting. They are going to crush you, Gwen. No, I replied softly, shifting my gaze back to the arrogant men across the table. They are going to try. Derek tapped a thick stack of legal documents against the table, bringing the room back to order. Gwen, this is a highly generous offer. You are a certified fraud examiner, a forensic accountant. You audit spreadsheets for a living. You do not understand the complexities of venture capital. Preston took the risks, so Preston gets the rewards. If you drag this out, I will personally ensure that the legal fees drain whatever pathetic savings you have left. You will walk away with nothing. I understand perfectly, Derek. I said, my voice completely steady. Preston gets Apex Innovations. All of its assets, all of its accounts, and its liabilities. Derek added quickly, flashing a predatory smile. Standard boilerplate. He takes the good with the bad. Though as we both know, Apex is highly profitable. Highly profitable. Preston smirked, leaning back in his leather chair. I built it from the ground up. That was a lie. I built the financial infrastructure. I secured our initial credit lines using my own impeccable credit score. I worked 80-hour weeks balancing the books while he played golf and called it networking. But I did not say any of that out loud. Because arguing with a narcissist is like screaming into a void. It only drains your oxygen, and my name is completely removed from the LLC. I asked, feigning hesitation. I hold no equity, no voting rights. None, Preston said sharply. You are completely out. I do not want you anywhere near my money. And the house. I pressed. Mine, Preston said. My name is on the mortgage. You just contributed to the down payment, which I am graciously allowing you to count as rent for the past 8 years. Beatrice chuckled again from the back row. Take the deal, Gwen, before he changes his mind and decides to sue you for emotional distress. Lord knows being married to someone so remarkably plain is distressing enough. Jillian, the 31-year-old sister of Preston, who had not held a job in 5 years, sat next to her mother and giggled loudly. Yeah, Gwen, go find a nice cubicle somewhere. Find. I took a deep breath, letting the toxicity wash over me. I did not feel angry anymore. I felt surgical. When you are a forensic accountant, you do not deal in emotions. You deal in receipts. You deal in ledgers. You look for the discrepancies that people try to hide in the fine print. And right now, Preston and Derek were so blinded by their own arrogance, so eager to strip me of my dignity, that they had not bothered to look at the fine print of their own destruction. Fine, I said, my voice dropping to a defeated whisper. Give me the documents. Derek's eyes lit up with triumphant greed. He slid the heavy 200-page settlement across the polished wood table. My mother let out a loud exhale of relief beside me. I pulled the document toward me. The paper felt heavy. I flipped past the title page, past the asset division, and past the custody arrangement that gave Preston exactly what he wanted. I flipped all the way to the back, to a section that had not been there when Derek initially drafted the agreement. A section I had my own discreet counsel slip into the final revised stack just 24 hours ago. Exhibit C was a masterpiece of legal camouflage. Nestled between the standard boilerplate severability clauses and the notary's signature blocks, it looked like a standard release of claims. But it was an indemnification and hold harmless agreement, drafted with absolute precision. I kept my face perfectly blank as my eyes scanned the paragraph I had memorized. It explicitly stated that the transferee Preston and the guarantor Beatrice hereby agreed to assume 100% of all legal, financial, and civil liabilities. This included unrecorded debts, federal tax obligations, penalties, and criminal restitution associated with Apex Innovations, LLC. It stated that I was completely indemnified, released, and held harmless from any federal claims targeting the entity. It was bulletproof. Derek was so convinced of his own intellectual superiority that he had skimmed the final revision, assuming I was too intimidated to alter his perfect contract. Furthermore, Beatrice had eagerly signed on as a guarantor to ensure I was locked out of the house, immediately tying her own personal assets directly to the liability of the company. "Are you going to read the whole thing, or are you going to sign it?" Preston snapped, tapping his fingers impatiently on the table. "I have a lunch reservation. I just want to be thorough," I murmured, uncapping my pen. "Derek, just to be clear on the record, by signing this, I am forfeiting all rights to the company, and Preston is assuming complete and total responsibility for Apex Innovations. Every asset, every liability." Asked and answered Gwen. Derek sighed, rolling his eyes. "Yes. Preston takes the whole pie. You are absolved of the company. It is a clean break. Now sign the paper." I pressed the nib of the pen to the signature line. I did not hesitate. I did not tremble. I signed my name with sharp, deliberate strokes. I flipped the page and signed the next one. I initialed every single page of Exhibit C, ensuring there could be no claim of accidental inclusion. When I was done, I slid the stack back across the table. Derek snatched it up eagerly. He quickly flipped to the back, checking only for my signature. He saw the ink, but he did not read the words above it. He nodded at Preston. Preston let out a loud, obnoxious breath. Finally. Jesus, that took forever. "Have my lawyer send over the final stamped copies. I am out of here." The judge, an older man who had been silently reviewing files on his bench, looked down at me over his glasses. "Mrs. Hayes, you understand that by entering this agreement, you are waiving your right to future discovery regarding the business assets of your husband." "I understand, Your Honor," I said clearly. I did not need future discovery. I already had everything I needed. "Very well," the judge said, striking his gavel loudly. "The settlement is accepted. Court is adjourned." The sound of the gavel was the starting gun for their celebration. Beatrice immediately stood up, clapping her hands together. "Oh, wonderful! Jillian, call the country club. Tell them to put 3 bottles of champagne on ice. We have an empire to celebrate." Martha grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my sleeve. "Come on, let us just go. Do not cause a scene. You can move back into your old room at my apartment until you find a cheap rental." I pulled my arm out of the grip of my mother. "I am not moving into your apartment, Mom. I have a hotel booked for the week." "A hotel? With what money?" Martha hissed. "You just gave away millions." I did not answer her. I turned to look at Derek, who was stuffing the signed documents into his leather briefcase. He caught me looking and paused, flashing a patronizing smile. "No hard feelings, Gwen," Derek said smoothly. "It is just business. You are out of your depth. Preston is playing in the big leagues now. You should be glad you got out without owing him money." "You are right, Derek," I said, my voice eerily calm. "It is just business, and I am very glad I got out without owing anyone money." Derek frowned slightly, a brief flicker of confusion crossing his face at my tone, but his arrogance quickly smothered it. He closed his briefcase with a loud snap and told me to have a good life. I walked out of the courtroom. The air in the hallway felt lighter. My mother trailed behind me, muttering under her breath about how I had ruined my life, how I was going to end up destitute, and how Preston was going to be a billionaire. I let her talk. I let her exhaust herself. When we reached the courthouse parking lot, the Chicago wind hit me in the face. It was brisk, sharp, and clearing. I walked over to my 10-year-old Honda Civic. Parked 3 spaces down was the gleaming black Porsche Macan that I had just signed away. I unlocked my car and sat in the driver's seat. Before starting the engine, I pulled out my phone. I opened my encrypted email app. At the very top of my inbox was a new message from a secure government server. The sender was listed as the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. I tapped it open. "Dear Ms. Hayes, this email serves as official confirmation that your whistleblower Form 211 regarding the fraudulent acquisition of federal PPP loans and subsequent wire fraud by Apex Innovations LLC and Preston Hayes has been fully processed and verified by our auditing team. Based on the irrefutable ledger evidence and offshore routing numbers, you provided a federal asset freeze will be executed at 8 in the morning on Monday. Your immunity as a cooperating witness is active. Thank you for your service to the United States Treasury." I locked my phone and tossed it into the passenger seat. I looked at myself in the rearview mirror. For the first time in 9 months, a genuine smile spread across my face. Preston and Derek thought they had outsmarted a number cruncher. They thought they had stolen an empire. They had no idea they had just successfully negotiated full, undisputed ownership of a sinking ship right as the Federal torpedo was hitting the hull. I sat in the driver's seat of my Honda Civic, the engine still off, letting the magnitude of what had just happened wash over me. The passenger door yanked open, and my mother dropped into the seat, bringing a cloud of nervous energy and cheap floral perfume into the confined space. "Are we just going to sit here all day?" Martha snapped aggressively, buckling her seatbelt and glaring at me. "Start the car, Gwen. I cannot bear to look at this courthouse for one more second. You have completely humiliated our family today." I kept my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel and stared straight ahead through the windshield. I did not turn the key. I needed a moment of absolute stillness before dealing with her. "Are you even listening to me?" Martha continued, her voice climbing to a shrill pitch. "You just handed over a multi-million-dollar company because you were too cowardly to fight. Do you know what my friends at the country club are going to say when they find out my daughter was tossed out onto the street with nothing but a 10-year-old car? They are going to laugh at me, Gwen. I will be a social outcast because you could not keep your husband happy." Her words bounced off me like rain on titanium. For my entire life, I had absorbed her anxiety and let it dictate my choices. She was a woman who valued the illusion of wealth over the reality of respect. Not anymore. I picked up my phone from the center console. I ignored the barrage of frantic text messages from my mother that were still unread on my screen and opened Instagram instead. I did not follow Preston on any social media platforms, but I knew exactly where to look to see the immediate fallout of my supposed defeat. I navigated to the public profile of Kelsey, the 24-year-old Pilates instructor who had been the catalyst for this entire divorce. Her page was a curated shrine of designer bags, luxury vacations, and perfectly angled gym selfies. And right at the top of her feed was a new story posted just 20 minutes ago. I tapped the glowing circle around her profile picture. The video started playing. Kelsey was standing in the grand foyer of the Highland Park mansion, the very same house I had spent months renovating meticulously, picking out the imported Italian marble and the crystal chandelier that hung above her head. She was wearing a tiny white tennis skirt and a matching crop top, holding a crystal flute of champagne. She spun around in a slow circle, beaming at the camera, showing off the vaulted ceilings and the sweeping mahogany staircase behind her. The caption plastered across the bottom of the video read in bold pink letters, "New beginnings in our house. So proud of my CEO baby. Goodbye toxic past, hello future." I watched the video loop a second time. I did not feel a single pang of jealousy or a rush of heartbreak. I looked at the marble floors and remembered the exact routing number of the offshore account Preston had used to pay the contractors. I looked at the chandelier and recalled the fraudulent invoice he had submitted to the Small Business Administration to cover the cost. Kelsey thought she was dancing in a palace. She was actually dancing inside an active federal crime scene. Every post, every location tag, every boastful caption she uploaded to the internet was just another piece of digital evidence tying Preston directly to the stolen funds. As a forensic accountant, I knew that social media was the greatest gift a criminal could give to a federal investigator. "You are looking at her page," Martha shrieked, leaning over the center console to peer at my screen. "Have you lost your mind? Why would you torture yourself like that? She is younger than you, Gwen. She is prettier than you. And now she is living in your house, spending your money. Put the phone away and drive." I did not put the phone away, because right at that moment a new notification dropped down from the top of my screen. It was a text message from Preston. I opened the message thread. Preston had sent a high-resolution photo of a receipt. The logo at the top clearly read, "Morton the Steakhouse." I scanned down past the list of expensive items to the total at the bottom, $5,240. Beneath the photo was a typed message from Preston, "Billed to the company card. We are having a little celebration with Derek and my mother. Good luck paying for groceries this week, sweetheart." I stared at the numbers on the receipt. $5,000 for a single Friday afternoon lunch. He had bought prime steaks, imported caviar, and probably 3 bottles of vintage champagne for his mother and his arrogant lawyer brother-in-law. And he had swiped the Apex Innovations corporate credit card to pay for it all. The sheer audacity of it was almost poetic. Preston was so drunk on his own perceived power that he wanted to rub my face in his wealth. He wanted me to sit in my cold car and imagine them laughing at me over a $5,000 meal. He wanted to break my spirit completely. But Preston did not understand the legal mechanics of what he was doing. By using the company card right after signing the divorce decree, he was actively establishing a paper trail of his undisputed ownership. He was proving to the federal government that he was in total control of the fraudulent accounts. He was buying luxury meals with stolen federal relief funds, and he was doing it right in front of a corporate attorney who should have known better. "Are you crying?" Martha asked, her tone shifting from angry to a bizarre kind of satisfied pity. "I told you this would hurt, Gwen. I told you to fight for a settlement." "I am not crying, Mother," I said, my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotion. I tapped the reply box on my screen. I did not write a paragraph explaining how much he had hurt me. I did not threaten to call the police. I did not beg for a share of the money. I typed exactly 3 words: enjoy the meal. I hit send. I locked my phone and tossed it into the passenger side door compartment, completely out of the reach of my mother. "You are weak," Martha muttered, crossing her arms over her chest and looking out the passenger window. "Just weak." I finally turned the key in the ignition. The old engine of the Honda sputtered to life, providing a stark contrast to the smooth purr of the Porsche Preston had driven away in. I pulled out of the courthouse parking lot and merged onto the busy Chicago street. "I am dropping you off at your apartment, Mom," I said calmly, keeping my eyes focused on the traffic ahead. "And then I am going to my hotel to rest." "You are going to need my help when you run out of money," Martha warned, her voice thick with judgment. "Do not come crying to me when you cannot afford to pay your rent next month." I did not bother to respond to her empty threats. The silence in the car stretched out heavy and absolute. I let her sit in her anxiety while I sat comfortably in my power. I was driving a 10-year-old car heading to a budget hotel with my entire life packed into 2 suitcases in the trunk. But I was the only person from that courtroom who was going to sleep peacefully tonight. Preston, Beatrice. Derek and Jillian were currently sitting in a high-end steakhouse, laughing at my expense, toasting to their brilliant legal victory. They thought they had secured an empire. They had absolutely no idea that the clock was already ticking down to Monday morning. Let them eat steak. Let them drink imported champagne. Let Kelsey dance in the foyer for her internet followers, because every single dollar they spent this weekend was just adding another month to their federal prison sentences, and I was going to watch it all burn from a safe, untouchable distance. The drive to my hotel took me past the glittering skyline of downtown Chicago. Seeing the towering bank buildings illuminated against the night sky reminded me of the exact moment the illusion of my marriage shattered. It was not a lipstick stain on a collar or a late-night text message that gave Preston away. It was the math. It was always the math. Exactly 3 months ago, I was awake at 3 in the morning. The house was dead silent. I was sitting at the massive kitchen island we had just installed my laptop screen, casting a harsh blue light across the dark room. Preston was upstairs sleeping soundly in our master bedroom. As the lead accountant for Apex Innovations, I was running a routine quarterly audit to prepare our state and federal tax filings. But the numbers were not adding up, not even close. There was a glaring hole in the cash flow projections that made absolutely no sense. Using my credentials as a certified fraud examiner, I bypassed the surface-level accounting software and dug deeper into the hidden subfolders of our main server. Preston was arrogant, but he was incredibly sloppy with his digital security. I cracked his secondary password in less than 10 minutes. That is when I found the phantom ledger. My eyes scanned the screen as I uncovered a complex web of offshore routing numbers attached to anonymous shell companies in the Cayman Islands. My heart hammered against my ribs, echoing loudly in my ears, as I traced the origin of the funds. Preston had submitted grossly falsified revenue reports to the federal government during the height of the pandemic. He had fraudulently acquired $3 million in Small Business Administration relief loans. These were funds meant to keep struggling businesses afloat and pay vulnerable employees. But Apex Innovations was not struggling, and the money was certainly not going to payroll. I sat there in the dark, barely breathing, as I watched the digital trail of stolen federal funds flow directly into our personal assets. I saw the massive wire transfer used for the down payment of the Highland Park mansion I was sitting in. I found the exact purchase price of the black Porsche Macan parked in our garage. And then I saw the personal expenses. $50,000 wired to a luxury jeweler in New York for a diamond tennis bracelet. $20,000 for a first-class trip to a resort in St. Bart's. All of it was categorized under generic corporate consulting expenses. I pulled up the original vendor receipts and saw the delivery name on the jewelry order, Kelsey. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. He was not just cheating on me, he was funding his entire lavish lifestyle and his mistress with stolen government money. And because my name was still listed as a co-founder on the LLC documents, he was dragging me right into the center of a massive federal crime. I was so intensely focused on downloading the files that I did not hear the footsteps padding softly across the hardwood floor behind me. Suddenly, the screen of my laptop flashed with an error message. The Wi-Fi signal dropped out instantly. I spun around in my chair. Beatrice was standing there in her expensive silk robe. Her hand was hovering over the wall outlet where she had just violently yanked the router cord from the socket. "What are you doing sneaking around in the dark like a rat, Gwen?" Beatrice demanded, her eyes narrowed in absolute contempt. I stared at her, my mind still racing from the magnitude of the crimes I had just uncovered. "He stole $3 million from the government, Beatrice." I whispered, my voice shaking with a mixture of rage and disbelief. "He used federal relief funds to buy this house and to pay for a mistress." Beatrice did not even blink. She did not look shocked. She did not look disappointed in her son. She just looked incredibly annoyed that I had found out. "Preston is a visionary," she hissed, stepping closer to me, her voice dripping with venom. "He is a genius building an empire, and geniuses know exactly how to leverage the system to their advantage. You are just a narrow-minded bean counter who cannot see the big picture. Stop nagging him over pennies." "Pennies," I repeated, standing up from my chair. "This is federal wire fraud. This is prison. Do you really think a man of his caliber is going to stay faithful to a woman who wears discount suits and stays up all night looking at spreadsheets?" Beatrice laughed, a cruel mocking sound that echoed in the dark kitchen. "You are lucky he even tolerates a boring wife like you. He needed a woman who understands his ambition. Keep your mouth shut, Gwen, or I will personally make sure you lose everything. You will never see your children again." The memory faded as the harsh fluorescent lights of the parking garage snapped my attention back to the present. I pulled my Honda into a designated spot at a private high-security storage facility on the industrial outskirts of the city. I killed the engine and stepped out into the cool, damp air of the concrete structure. I walked down the long, silent corridor until I reached the heavy steel door of Unit 402. I punched a complex 6-digit passcode into the electronic keypad and pressed my thumb firmly against the biometric scanner. The heavy deadbolt clicked open with a satisfying heavy thud. I gripped the handle and rolled up the metal door. The unit was not filled with old furniture or boxes of winter clothes. It was completely empty except for a climate-controlled server rack humming quietly in the center of the room. A series of green LED lights blinked rhythmically in the dim space. It contained 3 massive, unalterable hard drives. The night Beatrice unplugged the router and threatened to take my children away, she thought she had stopped me. She thought she had intimidated the boring accountant into submission. She had absolutely no idea that I had already downloaded the entire Phantom Ledger onto a physical encrypted drive before she ever walked into the kitchen. I walked forward and reached out, resting my hand on the warm metal casing of the servers. This was the undeniable raw data. Every fraudulent wire transfer, every fake invoice, every single federal crime Preston committed was locked inside this room. I had built a fortress of evidence they could never touch. And on Monday morning, the federal government was going to get the encryption keys. I left the storage facility and drove through the quiet industrial park, heading toward the modest extended stay hotel I had booked for the week. It was a far cry from the sprawling Highland Park mansion with its imported Italian marble and vaulted ceilings. The lobby smelled faintly of stale coffee and industrial carpet cleaner. The elevator rattled as it took me to the third floor, but as I unlocked the door to room 312 and stepped inside, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. The room was small and entirely unremarkable. It had a basic double bed, a generic landscape painting bolted to the wall, and a small laminate desk pushed up against the window. To anyone else, it might have looked like a massive downgrade. To me, it was a fortress. It was my temporary command center. I tossed my keys onto the nightstand and pulled my laptop from my bag. My phone vibrated aggressively against the cheap wood of the desk. The screen lit up with the name of my mother. Martha had been calling me relentlessly for the past 2 hours. I let the phone ring until it went to voicemail, then opened my messages to see the digital panic attack she was having. There were over 20 text messages, and each one was more unhinged than the last. "Gwen, you need to answer your phone right now. People are talking. Susan from the tennis committee just called to ask if it was true that Preston kicked you out of your own house." She sounded so incredibly smug about it. "I am absolutely mortified. You need to call Preston immediately and apologize. Beg him to let you stay in the guest house if you have to. I cannot show my face at the country club tomorrow knowing my daughter is living out of a suitcase like a vagrant. You are ruining my reputation." I read the messages with a detached clinical fascination. My mother was watching the life of her daughter collapse, and her primary concern was the opinion of a woman she played tennis with on Tuesday mornings. For 33 years, I had bent over backwards to accommodate her endless anxiety. I had chosen a safe career, married a man who looked good on paper, and absorbed her constant criticisms. But signing that divorce decree had severed more than just my toxic marriage. It had severed the invisible strings she used to control me. I swiped left on her name, put the phone on silent, and placed it face down on the bed. I had federal business to attend to. I sat down at the small desk and booted up my laptop. I connected to a secure encrypted virtual private network. I opened a specialized browser and navigated to the official whistleblower portal for the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. The login process required multiple layers of strict authentication. Once I was inside the secure dashboard, I clicked on the active case file attached to my whistleblower form 211. The interface of the portal was stark and highly functional. I scrolled down to the supplementary evidence section and clicked the upload button. I attached the high-resolution digital scans of the finalized divorce decree that the judge had signed just hours earlier. But I did not simply upload the document and log off. I included a detailed cover letter directed specifically to the lead investigator assigned to my case. I typed out the explanation with the precision of a surgeon. I directed their attention to page 198. The indemnification and hold harmless agreement. I explained that as of 2 o'clock this afternoon, Preston Hayes and Beatrice Hayes had legally assumed total and exclusive liability for Apex Innovations, LLC. They had voluntarily taken ownership of the fraudulent accounts, the stolen federal funds, and all associated tax obligations. I pointed out that my name was now officially and legally severed from the business entity by a binding court order. By pushing me out of the company to satisfy their own greed, Preston and Derek had inadvertently provided me with the ultimate legal shield. As a cooperating witness under the whistleblower program, I was already negotiating immunity. But Exhibit C made it absolute. I was no longer a co-owner turning state evidence. I was an independent third party who had been completely exonerated by the prime suspects themselves. They had signed a massive confession disguised as a divorce settlement. I reviewed my submission one final time. Every date, every routing number, Every legal precedent was perfectly aligned. I clicked submit. A bright green checkmark appeared on the screen, confirming that the encrypted file had been successfully transmitted to the federal servers in Washington, D.C. I leaned back in the cheap desk chair and exhaled a long, shaky breath. The adrenaline that had been keeping me upright all day was finally starting to fade. I looked out the window at the dark highway, watching the headlights of passing cars. I wondered what Preston and Kelsey were doing right now. Probably opening another expensive bottle of champagne. Probably making extravagant plans for the millions they thought they had secured. My laptop chimed quietly, indicating an incoming secure audio call through the portal. I sat forward immediately. The caller ID simply displayed a string of zeros. It was a direct line from the agency. I put my headset on and accepted the call. Ms. Hayes. A deep professional voice spoke through the headphones. This is Special Agent Miller with the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. I am here, Agent Miller, I replied, keeping my voice steady. We received your upload. My team has reviewed the finalized divorce decree and specifically the indemnification clause in... The agent paused, and I could hear the faint sound of papers shuffling in the background. Your brother-in-law drafted this document himself. Yes, he did, I said. He is a senior partner at a corporate law firm here in Chicago. Agent Miller let out a short, low chuckle that sounded entirely devoid of humor. Well, Ms. Hayes, I have been investigating corporate fraud for 20 years, and I have never seen a defense attorney package his own client for federal indictment quite so neatly. This document effectively nullifies any defense they could mount regarding shared culpability. You are completely in the clear. Your immunity agreement is fully executed. Thank you, Agent Miller, I said, feeling a massive weight finally lift off my shoulders. What are the next steps? The next steps are out of your hands now, he replied, his tone shifting back to strict professional authority. You have provided us with the original ledgers, the offshore routing numbers, and the proof of sole ownership. A federal judge signed off on the warrants 10 minutes ago. Get some rest this weekend, Ms. Hayes. The raid on Apex Innovations is scheduled for 8 in the morning on Monday. I thanked Agent Miller and closed my laptop. For the first time in months, I fell asleep the moment my head hit the pillow. When I woke up on Saturday morning, the air outside was crisp and clear. I had one final chore to complete before I could completely detach myself from the wreckage of my marriage. I needed to go back to the Highland Park mansion to pack the last of the clothes and toys belonging to my children. I parked my Honda in the driveway of the sprawling estate. The massive front doors were unlocked. As I pushed them open, the familiar smell of expensive citrus diffuser oil hit me. The house was quiet, but I could hear the faint sound of pop music echoing from the backyard patio. I walked through the grand foyer, my shoes clicking against the imported Italian marble, and looked out the massive glass doors leading to the pool area. Jillian was lounging on one of the expensive teak sunbeds. My 31-year-old sister-in-law was wearing an oversized designer swimsuit cover up her eyes, hidden behind massive sunglasses. Next to her was a silver ice bucket, chilling a bottle of vintage Pinot Grigio that I had specifically purchased from a vineyard in Napa Valley last year. She was sipping my expensive wine at 10 in the morning on a Saturday. I opened the glass door and stepped out onto the patio. Jillian lazily turned her head toward me. She did not look embarrassed or surprised. Instead, a cruel, lazy smile spread across her face. "Look who decided to show up," Jillian drawled, swirling the pale wine in her crystal glass. "I was starting to think you were too humiliated to come back here. I need to get the winter coats and the rest of the toys from the nursery," I said, keeping my voice flat and completely devoid of emotion. Jillian scoffed and sat up, swinging her legs over the edge of the sunbed. She reached down and kicked a large, heavy black plastic trash bag across the pristine patio stones. It slid to a stop right at my feet with a dull thud. "Save yourself the trip upstairs," Jillian said, taking another sip of her wine. "I had the housekeeper throw all the cheap plastic junk in there this morning. You need to be completely out of here by noon, Gwen. Kelsey is coming over with an interior designer later today. She wants to rip up the carpets in the nursery and redecorate the whole room into a luxury home Pilates gym. She says the natural lighting in that room is perfect for her workout aesthetic." I looked down at the trash bag containing the belongings of my children. A normal mother might have screamed at her. A normal ex-wife might have thrown the heavy silver ice bucket directly into the swimming pool, but I was not just an ex-wife. I was the architect of their impending destruction. I looked back up at Jillian. She was practically vibrating with the desperate desire for a reaction. She wanted me to cry. She wanted me to beg for respect. Derek said he practically legally castrated you in that courtroom yesterday. Jillian laughed, setting her glass down on the patio table. He said it was the easiest negotiation of his entire professional career. He told Preston you just rolled over and gave up because you knew you were outmatched. It is pathetic, honestly, but I guess that is what happens when a nobody tries to play in the big leagues with our family. You should grab your garbage bag and leave before Preston wakes up. He does not want to see your face in his house. You are right, Jillian, I said softly, bending down to pick up the heavy plastic bag. It was an incredibly easy negotiation for Derek. Tell Preston I appreciate him taking the company off my hands so quickly. Jillian rolled her eyes and laid back down on the sunbed, turning the volume up on her waterproof speaker. Do not let the door hit you on the way out, she muttered dismissively. I slung the heavy bag over my shoulder and walked back inside the house. I did not feel a single shred of anger toward Jillian. In less than 48 hours, this mansion was going to be swarming with armed federal agents. That teak sunbed would be seized as an asset purchased with fraudulent funds. Jillian would be standing on the curb with nothing but the designer swimsuit she was wearing. I carried the bag through the massive chef kitchen, heading toward the garage door to leave. As I passed the sprawling marble kitchen island, something caught my eye. Preston had left his laptop open and completely unlocked. I stopped in my tracks. Preston was famously paranoid about his devices, but his arrogance had clearly overridden his caution this weekend. He believed he had won. He believed I was a defeated, terrified woman who would never dare to snoop again. He felt completely invincible in his own home. I set the trash bag down on the floor and stepped silently toward the island. I looked at the glowing screen. He was logged into the primary corporate banking portal for Apex Innovations, the very same account that held the remaining balance of the stolen Federal Small Business Administration loans. I leaned in closer, my eyes darting across the digital ledger. Preston was in the middle of executing a massive active wire transfer. The amount was exactly $500,000. I looked at the destination routing information. He was not sending the money to a vendor. He was not investing in software. He was transferring $500,000 of stolen federal relief money directly into an anonymous offshore cryptocurrency wallet registered in the Bahamas. He was trying to hide the cash. He knew the money was dirty, and he was actively laundering it right there on his kitchen island, while his mistress planned her home gym and his sister drank stolen wine by the pool. A slow, cold smile spread across my face. Agent Miller had told me they had enough evidence for a raid, but this was the absolute holy grail of financial crimes. Active real-time money laundering. It proved undeniable premeditated criminal intent. This single transaction would upgrade his federal charges from standard fraud to aggravated money laundering, carrying a mandatory minimum sentence that Derek could never negotiate away. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I opened the camera app, making sure the flash was completely disabled. I held the phone steady over the laptop screen and snapped 3 high-resolution photographs. I captured the exact amount, the source account, the destination wallet address, and the digital timestamp glowing in the bottom corner of the screen. I slipped my phone back into my pocket, picked up the heavy trash bag, and walked out the door. I did not look back. I loaded the bag into the trunk of my Honda and drove away from the Highland Park mansion for the very last time. I was smiling the entire way back to my hotel. Preston thought he was a criminal mastermind moving digital ghosts across borders. He had no idea I had just captured the photograph that would put the final nail in his concrete coffin. After securing the photographic evidence of the money laundering, I spent the rest of my Saturday afternoon ensuring my children were completely insulated from the impending explosion. I picked up my son and daughter and drove them straight to the house of my best friend. She was a woman who knew the truth about my divorce and had generously offered to host them for a long weekend slumber party. I hugged my children tightly in her suburban driveway, promising we would have our own special celebration next week. I needed them safely out of the blast radius when the federal agents descended on their father. With my children secure, I had one final loose end to tie up. I drove across town to the upscale condominium complex where my mother lived. I had forwarded my personal mail to her address a few weeks ago when I realized my marriage was collapsing. I needed a secure place for my bank statements and legal correspondence, away from the prying eyes of Preston. It was a temporary measure, but now I needed to retrieve those documents before I initiated my complete disappearance from their toxic social circle. I parked my Honda between a row of luxury vehicles in the visitor lot. The apartment of my mother was on the 4th floor. It was a meticulously decorated space designed to project an image of old money that she simply did not possess. Everything from the velvet throw pillows to the stacks of unread architectural magazines on her glass coffee table was a carefully curated lie. I knocked twice on the heavy wooden door. It swung open almost immediately. Martha was standing there in a tailored beige twin set, her hair perfectly coiffed, her expression twisted into a mask of furious indignation. She did not say hello. She did not ask how I was holding up after being thrown out of my home. She just stepped aside, grabbed my arm with surprising force, and yanked me into the foyer. "Do you have any idea what you have done to me today?" Martha hissed, slamming the front door shut behind me. She paced aggressively across her expensive Persian rug. "I just got off the phone with Eleanor from the garden club. She heard from Beatrice that Preston took the entire company and the house, and that you are living in some cheap motel out by the interstate. Is that true, Gwen? Tell me Beatrice is lying." "I am staying at a hotel, Mom," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly even. "I am just here to get my mail." Martha threw her hands up in the air, her face flushing red with absolute outrage. "A hotel. My daughter is practically homeless while her ex-husband is celebrating his massive corporate success. This is unacceptable." "You are embarrassing me, Gwen. You are embarrassing this entire family. I raised you to be smart, to be pragmatic, but instead you threw a tantrum over some silly little affair and threw away a fortune." The absolute lack of empathy was breathtaking. I stood there and watched the woman who had given birth to me reduce systematic emotional abuse, infidelity, and federal fraud to a silly little affair. For my entire life, I had shrunk myself to fit into the tiny, anxious boxes she drew for me. I had swallowed my pride to keep the peace. But today, I felt absolutely nothing for her except a profound clinical pity. "You need to fix this." Martha stepped closer, pointing a manicured finger directly at my chest. "You are going to drive back to Highland Park right now. You are going to apologize to Preston for whatever it is you did to make him so angry. You will beg him for your job back at the company. You will tell him you overreacted, and you want to be the chief financial officer again. If you have to tolerate his little fitness instructor on the side, then you tolerate her. That is what women in our circle do. We look the other way to protect our investments. I refuse to be the mother of a failure." I looked past her shoulder at the stack of envelopes sitting on the marble entryway table. My name was printed neatly on the top letter. I walked past my mother, picked up the stack of mail, and tucked it into my purse. The physical act of taking back my mail felt incredibly symbolic. I was taking back my life, my privacy, and my future. "I am not going back to Highland Park," I said, turning to face her with absolute calm. "I am not apologizing to Preston, and I am certainly not begging him for a job at a company that is about to collapse. I am starting over on my own terms." "Starting over?" Martha shrieked, her voice cracking as her anger gave way to genuine panic. "With what money? You are a single mother with a 10-year-old car. You are nothing without him. You are going to drag my reputation down into the gutter with you because of your selfish pride. I cannot show my face at the country club, knowing everyone is laughing at my destitute daughter." I looked my mother directly in the eyes. I saw the hollow, desperate core of her existence. She cared more about the whispers of wealthy women she barely liked than she cared about the safety and sanity of her own child. I realized in that moment that she was just as toxic as Beatrice. They were two sides of the same poisonous coin, entirely motivated by greed and the perception of status. Listen to me very carefully, Mother, I said, my voice dropping to a low, commanding register that made her flinch. Preston is a criminal. He is a fraud who stole millions of dollars from the federal government. He used that stolen money to buy his house, his cars, and his mistresses. He is going to spend the next decade in a federal penitentiary. I am not bowing down to a thief to save your social life. Martha stared at me, her jaw slack, her eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and terror. She opened her mouth to speak, to defend the wealth she worshipped so deeply, but no words came out. The truth was too massive for her shallow worldview to process. I turned my back on her and put my hand on the cold brass doorknob. The realization that I was actually leaving, that she could no longer control me with guilt and shame, finally shattered her composure completely. "If you walk out that door, you have no family," Martha screamed at my back, her voice echoing shrilly against the high ceilings of her apartment. I turned the knob and pulled the door open. I did not look over my shoulder. I did not shed a single tear for the mother I was leaving behind. "I have not had a family in years," I said softly, but clearly enough for her to hear every single syllable. I stepped out into the quiet hallway and pulled the heavy door shut behind me. The loud slam echoed through the corridor like a gunshot, severing the final toxic tie to my past. I walked toward the elevator with my head held high, completely ready to face the beautiful destruction of Monday morning. While I was ordering a simple room service dinner in my quiet hotel room miles away in Highland Park, Preston was throwing the party of the century. It was officially billed as a housewarming celebration for his new life with Kelsey. But everyone in our social circle knew exactly what it was. It was a divorce victory lap. I did not need to be on the guest list to know every single detail of the event. I had seen the vendor quotes he had tried to push through the Apex Innovations accounting software just days before I left. Preston was funding his own massive ego trip using the exact same stolen federal relief money that was about to send him to prison. The driveway of the mansion was packed with luxury vehicles. Inside, the grand foyer had been transformed into a nightclub. He had hired a live string quartet to play modern pop songs. There was an ice sculpture of the company logo sitting in the center of the room. The catering alone was a $15,000 extravagant spread featuring Wagyu beef sliders, a massive raw oyster bar, and towers of imported French macarons. It was a stunning display of wealth, and every single cent of it belonged to the United States Treasury. In the formal living room, Derek was holding court by the massive stone fireplace. He was nursing a glass of expensive scotch surrounded by a group of junior partners and rival corporate lawyers. He was absolutely basking in the glow of his perceived legal genius. I completely outmaneuvered her. Derek boasted, his voice loud enough to echo over the music. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass and smirked. It was the easiest negotiation of my entire career. You guys should have seen it. I slid a 200-page document across the table demanding the house, the cars, and 100% equity in the company. She did not even put up a fight. She just picked up her pen and signed her life away. One of the younger lawyers shook his head in disbelief. No alimony at all. How did you get her to agree to that? Derek laughed, a booming sound full of arrogance. Because she is just a glorified bookkeeper. She lacks the intellectual stamina for a real legal battle. I threatened to bury her in litigation fees, and she folded like a cheap lawn chair. Preston walked away with the entire empire free and clear. It was a masterclass in aggressive asset protection. The other men chuckled and raised their glasses in a toast to Derek. They were celebrating a legal victory that was actually a signed confession to a federal crime. Derek was bragging about legally binding his own mother-in-law to a multi-million-dollar fraud case, and he thought he was the smartest man in the room. Across the room, the music faded down. Preston stepped up onto the bottom step of the sweeping mahogany staircase. He tapped a silver spoon against his crystal champagne flute, demanding the attention of the crowded room. Kelsey was draped over his arm, wearing a diamond tennis bracelet that had been purchased with a federal loan meant for struggling small businesses. "Thank you all for coming tonight," Preston projected his voice, flashing his perfectly whitened teeth at the crowd of wealthy guests. Tonight is about celebrating the future. For a long time, I was held back by a small-minded middle-class mentality. I was tied to someone who wanted to save pennies, while I wanted to build a legacy. A polite murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Beatrice was standing in the front row, wiping a fake tear of pride from her eye. Jillian was cheering loudly beside her. To be a true visionary, you have to take massive risks. Preston continued, raising his glass higher. You cannot let fearful people dictate your velocity. I shed the dead weight. I claimed what is rightfully mine. And now, with Kelsey by my side, Apex Innovations is going to reach heights that a simple accountant could never even comprehend. To the future. The crowd erupted into applause. Glasses clinked. People cheered for the brilliant CEO. It was the absolute peak of his narcissistic delusion. As the applause began to die down and the string quartet started playing again, a man in a crisp black suit discreetly approached Preston. It was the manager of the luxury catering company. He looked pale and extremely uncomfortable. He leaned in close to Preston, trying to keep his voice down over the music. "Excuse me, Mr. Hayes," the catering manager whispered, his eyes darting nervously around the room. "I am so sorry to interrupt your celebration, but there seems to be an issue with your payment method." Preston frowned, visibly annoyed that his victory lap was being interrupted by a vendor. "What do you mean there is an issue? I gave your staff the corporate black card this morning. Just run it for the $15,000 and add a 20% gratuity." "I did, sir," the manager replied, holding up a sleek digital payment tablet. "We have tried to process the transaction 3 times. The corporate black card is declining. The terminal is giving an error code stating the account is restricted. We need an alternative form of payment for the catering spread tonight." Preston scoffed loudly, rolling his eyes as if he were dealing with an incompetent child. "It is a fraud alert. The bank algorithm probably flagged it because it is a weekend transaction for a large amount. I will call my wealth manager on Monday and have him sort out their ridiculous security protocols." Preston reached into the inside pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a silver leather wallet. He aggressively slid a personal platinum credit card out of the slot and slapped it onto the digital tablet of the catering manager. "Here. Just put it on my personal account for now." Preston snapped, waving the man away. "And be quick about it. I have guests to entertain." The catering manager nodded quickly and hurried away toward the kitchen. Preston turned back to his party, wrapping his arm around the waist of Kelsey, completely unbothered. He thought it was just a minor inconvenience. He thought it was an overly sensitive fraud algorithm at his bank. He had absolutely no idea that his corporate accounts were not experiencing a technical glitch. They were locked down in a federal freeze. And that personal platinum card he just handed over was linked to a joint account with Beatrice, which was exactly the next target on the list of the Internal Revenue Service. Monday morning arrived with the crisp efficiency that Preston always claimed to love. He woke up in the master suite of the Highland Park mansion, leaving Kelsey asleep in the massive California king bed. He dressed in a bespoke charcoal suit, checked the reflection of his gold Rolex in the mirror, and drove his luxury SUV toward the financial district of downtown Chicago. His only annoyance was the lingering issue with the credit cards from his extravagant party on Saturday night. He fully planned to walk into his private bank, demand the termination of whoever had authorized the fraud alert on his accounts, and manually push through the $500,000 offshore transfer he had initiated over the weekend. At exactly 8:30 in the morning, Preston pushed through the heavy glass doors of the elite financial institution. This was not a regular retail bank branch with long lines and generic teller windows. It was a private wealth management office characterized by quiet marble floors, polished mahogany desks, and hushed conversations among the ultra-wealthy. Preston was accustomed to being greeted by name the moment he walked in. He expected to be offered sparkling water and ushered immediately into a private glass suite. He strode confidently past the reception desk and approached the glass-enclosed office of his personal wealth manager, a man named Bradley. The door was closed. Preston knocked once sharply and opened it without waiting for an invitation. The office was completely empty. Annoyed, he turned back to the main floor and snapped his fingers at a young associate teller who was standing behind the counter staring at him with wide, frightened eyes. "I need to see Bradley immediately," Preston demanded, his voice echoing far too loudly in the quiet space. "My corporate cards were inexplicably declined this weekend, and I have a pending wire transfer of $500,000 that has been stalled since Saturday. Fix it right now." The young teller swallowed hard and took a physical step back from the marble counter. "Please wait one moment, Mr. Hayes. Let me get the senior branch executive for you." Preston scoffed loudly, leaning his elbows on the polished counter. He checked his watch again, projecting extreme impatience. He mentally rehearsed the brutal dressing down he was going to deliver to the management team. He believed he was a multi-million-dollar VIP client. He expected absolute perfection and complete submission from anyone providing him a service. A heavy oak door at the back of the bank opened. It was not Bradley. It was the senior branch executive, a man who usually only appeared to shake hands over massive investment portfolios. Today, the executive was not smiling. Furthermore, he was not alone. He was flanked by two large, stern-faced bank security guards, who positioned themselves slightly ahead of him as they approached the counter. Preston stood up straight, narrowing his eyes at the highly unusual entourage. "What is going on here?" he asked, his tone shifting rapidly from annoyed to genuinely confused. "Where is Bradley? I need my accounts unlocked immediately so I can finalize my venture capital investments." The branch manager stopped a few feet away from Preston, keeping the security guards between them. He did not offer his hand in greeting. He did not offer an apology for the inconvenience. He looked at Preston with a mixture of professional detachment and absolute finality. "Mr. Hayes," the manager said, his voice completely devoid of the usual sycophantic warmth reserved for rich clients, "we cannot unlock your accounts. As of 8 o'clock this morning, all of your assets held by this institution have been frozen." Preston let out a harsh, incredulous laugh. "Frozen? What are you talking about? I am the sole owner of Apex Innovations. I just submitted the finalized legal documents on Friday proving I have total equity. Unfreeze the corporate accounts and execute my $500,000 wire transfer right now, or I am moving my entire portfolio to a competitor by noon." The manager did not flinch at the aggressive threat. "We no longer want your portfolio, Mr. Hayes. We cannot execute any transfers, and you cannot withdraw a single dollar. Every single account associated with your Social Security number and your corporate tax identification number has been seized. This includes your personal checking, the Apex Innovations operating accounts, and the joint platinum accounts you hold with your mother, Beatrice Hayes." The mention of the joint accounts with his mother made the blood drain entirely from the face of Preston. The arrogant sneer vanished, replaced by a sudden sharp spike of genuine panic. "How do you have the authority to do that?" he demanded, his voice rising in volume and cracking slightly. "This is illegal. You are stealing my money." "We are complying with a federal mandate," the manager replied coldly, handing Preston a thick manila envelope. Inside that envelope is a copy of the seizure order. "Your accounts have been frozen pursuant to a federal warrant issued by the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. We have been instructed to inform you that any attempt to move digital funds or access safety deposit boxes is now considered a federal offense. I must ask you to leave the premises immediately, or these guards will forcefully escort you out." Preston snatched the envelope from the hands of the manager. His fingers were trembling. The Internal Revenue Service. A criminal investigation. His mind raced frantically, trying to connect the dots. He thought he had covered his tracks perfectly. He thought the offshore routing numbers were completely anonymous. He had no idea that I had handed the federal agents a perfectly mapped blueprint of his entire fraudulent empire. "This is a mistake," Preston stammered, backing away from the counter as the security guards took a synchronized step forward. "This is a massive misunderstanding. My lawyer will have this sorted out in an hour. You are going to be fired for this." The manager simply turned his back and walked away. The security guards crossed their arms, staring Preston down until he turned and practically ran out of the heavy glass doors. He stumbled out onto the busy Chicago sidewalk, the morning sun suddenly feeling harsh and blinding. The sounds of traffic and passing pedestrians faded into a dull roar in his ears. He ripped open the manila envelope and pulled out the legal document. The bold words jumped off the page, confirming his absolute worst nightmare. Wire fraud, falsified federal loan applications, money laundering. Sheer panic seized his chest. He pulled his phone from his pocket with shaking hands. He needed to stop the bleeding. He needed his financial team to destroy the hard drives before anyone looked too closely at the internal ledgers. He dialed the direct cell phone number of the chief financial officer of Apex Innovations. The phone rang once, twice, then it went straight to a generic automated voicemail. Preston cursed loudly, drawing annoyed stares from passing commuters. He ended the call and tried again. Voicemail again. His own executive team was ignoring his calls. He paced back and forth on the concrete sidewalk, his mind spinning completely out of control. He needed to get to the office. He needed to manually wipe the servers himself before the government found the phantom ledgers. He turned toward his luxury SUV, ready to sprint to the parking garage and break every speed limit to reach his corporate headquarters. Just as he reached for the door handle of his car, his phone vibrated violently in his hand. A text message notification popped up on the locked screen. It was from his executive secretary. Preston unlocked the phone and opened the message with a deep sense of dread. The text was written entirely in panicked capital letters. Preston, do not come to the office. Men in wind shirts are confiscating the computers. While Preston was hyperventilating on a downtown sidewalk, staring at a panicked text message from his secretary Derek was 20 floors up in a glass corner office, living his absolute best life. The law firm of Derek was one of the most prestigious corporate litigation firms in the city. His office boasted floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the deep blue expanse of Lake Michigan. He sat behind a massive custom mahogany desk, wearing a bespoke navy suit that cost more than the average car. At that exact moment, Derek was pouring 2 glasses of incredibly rare bourbon for himself and a junior partner named Harrison. Harrison was a young, eager attorney who hung on to every word Derek said, hoping to learn the aggressive tactics that had made Derek a junior partner at such a young age. I am telling you, Harrison, the practice of law is 90% posture and 10% paperwork, Derek said smoothly, handing the crystal glass across the desk. Take the Hayes divorce settlement I finalized on Friday. The opposing party was a forensic accountant. She crunches numbers for a living. By all accounts, she should have spotted the leverage points. But I walked into that courtroom, established absolute dominance, and she surrendered an entire tech company without a single counteroffer. Harrison took a sip of the bourbon, his eyes wide with admiration. You got her to sign away everything, even the house. Derek laughed, leaning back in his expensive leather chair and propping his Italian leather shoes on the edge of the desk. I did not just get her to sign it away. I got her to thank me for the privilege. I drafted a 200-page fortress of a document. It was a masterclass in aggressive asset consolidation. I gave Preston total control of the company and shielded the entire portfolio from future discovery. She walked out of there with a 10-year-old car and a bruised ego. That is how you win, Harrison. You do not negotiate. You dictate. Before Harrison could offer another compliment, the sleek digital intercom on the desk of Derek buzzed loudly. Derek frowned. He hated being interrupted when he was holding court. He reached forward and pressed the silver button. What is it, Brenda? Derek snapped, his tone laced with heavy irritation. I told you I was not to be disturbed this morning unless it was a billable emergency. When Brenda spoke, her voice was completely devoid of its usual polished professionalism. She sounded breathless and utterly terrified. Mr. Hayes, I am so sorry to interrupt. There are men here. They bypassed the security desk downstairs. They said they are federal agents, and they are coming back to your office right now. Derek swung his legs off the desk, his brow furrowing in confusion. What are you talking about? Federal agents from where? Before the intercom could broadcast her answer, the heavy double doors of the corner office swung open with enough force to bounce against the wall. Harrison jumped out of his chair, spilling a few drops of rare bourbon onto the expensive carpet. Derek stood up instantly, his legal instincts kicking into high gear as he prepared to dress down whoever had just barged into his private sanctuary. Two men walked into the room. They were not wearing expensive suits. They wore dark tactical pants, duty belts holding sidearms, and navy blue windbreakers. Emblazoned across the back of the windbreakers in bold yellow letters were the initials IRSCI, the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. Derek Hayes, the lead agent asked. His voice was flat, carrying the unmistakable cadence of a man who did not care about corner offices or bespoke suits. "I am Derek Hayes," Derek replied, squaring his shoulders and utilizing his most intimidating courtroom voice. "And you are currently trespassing in a private law firm. I suggest you show me a warrant right now, or I will have building security physically remove you, and then I will sue your field office for harassment." The lead agent did not even blink. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a stack of documents, roughly the size of a phone book. He dropped it directly onto the middle of the pristine mahogany desk. It landed with a heavy, authoritative thud that rattled the crystal glasses. "You are being served with a federal subpoena for all communications drafts, emails, and financial ledgers regarding your client Preston Hayes and the corporate entity known as Apex Innovations," the agent recited, ignoring the threats of Derek entirely. Derek stared at the massive stack of paper. A cold prickle of unease started at the base of his neck, but his ego refused to let him show fear. "I am the attorney of record for Preston Hayes. Everything in my files is protected by attorney-client privilege. You cannot subpoena my work product without a direct order from a federal judge overcoming that privilege. This is a fishing expedition, and you know it." The second agent stepped forward. "The crime-fraud exception applies, Mr. Hayes. Attorney-client privilege is completely nullified when the attorney actively assists the client in the commission of an ongoing federal crime." Derek felt the air leave his lungs. He gripped the edge of his desk. "What ongoing federal crime?" he demanded, his voice losing a fraction of its commanding boom. "My client runs a legitimate technology startup. Your client runs a sophisticated money laundering operation funded entirely by stolen federal relief loans," the lead agent corrected him sharply. "And according to the finalized divorce decree filed in Cook County Family Court on Friday, you personally drafted the legal mechanism that consolidated those stolen funds. You aided and abetted federal wire fraud. You facilitated the transfer of illicit assets. You are no longer just the lawyer, Mr. Hayes. You are a named co-conspirator." Harrison, the junior partner, slowly backed away toward the door, his eyes darting between Derek and the armed federal agents. He was witnessing the absolute destruction of a career in real time. Derek felt a wave of genuine nausea wash over him. He reached down with trembling hands and flipped open the heavy cover of the federal warrant. His eyes darted aggressively across the densely typed pages, searching for a loophole, searching for the procedural error that he could use to throw the document out of court. He read the charges: wire fraud, bank fraud, conspiracy to commit money laundering. Then his eyes landed on a specific paragraph near the bottom of page 3. It was the section detailing the evidentiary basis for the warrant. He scanned the legal jargon until he hit the informant classification code. The text read clearly: "Evidence obtained via confidential informant and whistleblower portal. Witness is fully immunized from all prosecution based on the execution of Exhibit C indemnification and hold harmless agreement filed in Cook County Court." Witness is fully immunized. The breath hitched in the throat of Derek. The walls of the glass corner office suddenly felt like they were closing in on him. He stared at those words until they blurred together. He remembered the courtroom on Friday. He remembered Gwen sitting quietly, uncapping her silver pen. He remembered her asking him point blank if Preston was assuming all liabilities. He remembered his own arrogant voice telling her that Preston was taking the whole pie. Derek realized in that exact moment that he had not crushed Gwen. He had not outsmarted a middle-class bookkeeper. He had arrogantly and blindly walked his client, his mother-in-law, and himself straight into a federal trap designed by a forensic accountant. Gwen had not surrendered the company. She had handed them a ticking time bomb, and Derek was the fool who had officially wired the detonator. Pure, unadulterated horror washed over him as the federal agent stood silently waiting for him to surrender his files. Derek did not argue with the federal agents. He could not form the words to mount a defense. He handed over his encrypted hard drives and the physical case files for Apex Innovations, with shaking hands watching his prestigious legal career evaporate before his eyes. As soon as the agents walked out of his glass corner office, Derek grabbed his cell phone and sprinted toward the elevator bank. He needed to find Preston immediately. He dialed his brother-in-law repeatedly, but the line went straight to voicemail. Meanwhile, Preston was already driving like a madman toward the downtown accounting firm where I had recently taken a position as a senior auditor. He had picked up his mother Beatrice along the way after she called him in a state of absolute hysteria, claiming her joint platinum card was declined at a luxury boutique. Derek managed to intercept them just as they were aggressively pulling into the parking garage across the street from my office building. At that exact moment, I was sitting at my new desk on the 14th floor of a highly respected downtown financial firm. I had secured this position weeks ago quietly, anticipating the fallout of my marriage. I was peacefully reviewing a legitimate corporate tax return, sipping a cup of hot green tea. It was a stark contrast to the chaotic, fraudulent environment Preston had forced me to manage. Here, the numbers were real. The business was legitimate. I was respected for my meticulous attention to detail, not berated for it. The environment was quiet, methodical, and perfectly controlled. That peace was shattered when the heavy glass doors of the ground floor lobby were violently thrown open. Preston, Beatrice, and Derek stormed into the building. Preston was leading the charge. His face flushed a deep, angry crimson. Beatrice was right on his heels, clutching her designer handbag like a weapon, her face tight with absolute fury. Derek trailed slightly behind them, his face the color of wet ash. He had tried to stop them in the parking garage, but Preston was entirely consumed by his own narcissistic rage and refused to listen to reason. "I demand to see Gwendolyn Hayes right now!" Preston shouted, his voice echoing loudly off the polished marble floors of the massive lobby. He slammed his hand flat against the sleek reception desk, startling the young woman sitting behind it. "Call her down here immediately. She is a thief." Several employees walking through the lobby stopped in their tracks, holding their briefcases and coffees, watching the wealthy family completely unravel in public. The receptionist blinked in shock, her hand hovering over her phone. "Sir, I need you to lower your voice. You cannot just storm in here demanding to see our employees. If you do not step back, I will be forced to call building security." "Call them!" Beatrice shrieked, stepping up next to her son and pointing an accusatory finger at the terrified receptionist. "Call the police while you are at it. That woman hacked into the private bank accounts of my son and froze his money. She is a bitter, jealous ex-wife committing corporate espionage. Get her down here before we sue this entire firm for harboring a criminal." Derek grabbed the arm of Preston, trying desperately to pull him back from the desk. "Preston, we need to leave. You do not understand what is happening." Derek hissed, his voice trembling with a panic that Preston completely ignored. "Get your hands off me, Derek!" Preston snarled, shoving his lawyer away. "I am not leaving until that pathetic accountant comes down here and unlocks my bank accounts. She thinks she can play games with my wealth. I will destroy her." Upstairs, the phone on my desk chimed. It was the head of building security. He informed me that my ex-husband was causing a massive disturbance in the lobby and asked if I wanted the police involved. I told him to hold off on the police. I wanted to handle this personally. I stood up from my desk, smoothed the front of my tailored blazer, and walked toward the elevator bank. I felt absolutely no fear. I felt a cold, sharp sense of anticipation. I stepped into the elevator and watched the digital numbers count down to the lobby. When the silver doors slid open, I was flanked by two large, imposing security guards who had been waiting for me on the ground floor. I walked out into the center of the massive lobby. The commotion stopped instantly as Preston caught sight of me. He lunged forward, but the two security guards immediately stepped directly into his path, crossing their muscular arms and forming an impenetrable human wall. Preston strained against the invisible boundary, his eyes bulging, the veins in his neck popping violently against his expensive silk collar. He looked exactly like a cornered animal, realizing the cage had slammed shut. His bespoke charcoal suit could not hide the sheer desperation rolling off him. "You froze my money!" Preston screamed, his voice raw and echoing through the entire ground floor. "You hacked into my banking portal and locked me out. Unlock it right now, Gwen. I will sue you for everything you will ever make. I will take your car. I will take your new salary. You will be paying me financial damages for the rest of your miserable life." Beatrice stepped out from behind her son, her face twisted into an ugly snarl. "You are a vindictive witch," she yelled, her voice echoing shrilly. "We took the company from you fair and square. You signed the papers. You have no right to touch our assets. Tell your little hacker friends to give us our money back before I personally drag you into court and have you thrown in jail." I stood a few feet away from them, completely untouched by their venom. I did not raise my voice. I did not flinch. I just looked at them with the calm, detached expression of an auditor reviewing a particularly messy ledger. "I did not freeze your money, Preston," I said evenly, my voice slicing clearly through their frantic yelling. "And I certainly did not hack your accounts. I do not have the power to seize assets." "You are lying," Preston roared, stepping closer to the security guards. "You were the only one who had the passwords to the offshore accounts. You are the only one bitter enough to do this." Suddenly, a hand reached out and grabbed the shoulder of Preston with bone-crushing force. It was Derek. Derek was no longer the smug, untouchable corporate lawyer who had mocked me in family court just 3 days ago. He looked like a man who had just read his own death sentence. He was sweating profusely and his eyes were wide with pure, unadulterated terror. He yanked Preston back from the security guards. "Preston, shut up," Derek yelled, his voice cracking violently. "Just shut your mouth for 1 second. Preston spun around, furious at being commanded. "Do not tell me to shut up, Derek. I am your client. Fix this." Derek shook his head, his chest heaving as he struggled to pull oxygen into his lungs. He looked at Preston, then looked at Beatrice before finally turning his terrified gaze toward me. He finally understood the absolute perfection of the trap I had set. "She did not freeze your money, Preston." Derek gasped out the words, sounding like they were tearing his throat apart. "The Internal Revenue Service froze it. The Criminal Investigation Division raided my office 20 minutes ago. They raided your corporate headquarters. They have the phantom ledgers. They have the offshore routing numbers." Preston froze completely. The angry red flush drained from his face in a single heartbeat, leaving him looking sickly and pale. "The IRS," he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. "How?" "And Beatrice," Derek continued, turning to his mother-in-law with a look of absolute pity and horror. "They did not just freeze the corporate accounts. They traced the stolen federal funds. Because you signed as a guarantor on the divorce settlement, you assumed total legal liability. They froze your retirement accounts too. Every single penny you own is gone." The silence in the lobby was deafening. Beatrice stood frozen, her eyes darting frantically between Derek and Preston, trying to process the magnitude of the catastrophe. Then the realization finally hit her. Her money was gone. Her status, her wealth, her entire identity had been wiped out by a single federal order. Beatrice threw her head back and let out a piercing, guttural shriek that shattered the quiet professionalism of the building and echoed endlessly against the high marble walls. The echo of her shriek had barely faded before Beatrice snapped completely. The veneer of the wealthy, sophisticated matriarch shattered into a million pieces right there in the lobby of my new firm. She lunged forward, her manicured hands curled into claws, aiming directly for my face. The 2 security guards reacted instantly. One of them caught Beatrice by the shoulders, firmly pushing her back. She thrashed against his grip, her expensive designer handbag falling to the polished marble floor. It burst open, spilling luxury cosmetics, gold-plated compacts, and completely useless platinum credit cards across the ground. "You vindictive witch!" Beatrice screamed, spit flying from her lips as she struggled against the massive guard. "Call them right now and tell them to give us our money back. We took the company. We did not take the debts. You cannot do this to me. I am a guarantor, not a criminal. I did not take a single step backward. I watched her thrash and scream with the absolute emotional detachment of a scientist observing a predictable chemical reaction. She was right about one thing. She had taken the company. But her profound ignorance of corporate law was about to be put on public display for everyone in the building to witness. I reached into my structured leather tote bag and pulled out a thick, beautifully bound stack of paper. It was a crisp, notarized copy of the final divorce decree. The blue ink of the official notary stamp caught the bright fluorescent lights of the lobby. It was the exact same document Derek had smugly slid across the mahogany table in family court just 3 days ago. I looked past the hysterical, thrashing woman and locked eyes with Derek. He was still hyperventilating his expensive, bespoke navy suit, looking entirely too large for his suddenly deflated posture. I stepped around the security guard and held the heavy document out toward him. "Derek," I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the manic screaming of Beatrice. "Read this." He stared at the document like it was a live explosive device. He slowly reached out and took it, his hands shaking so violently that the thick pages audibly rustled. The other employees in the lobby stood in stunned silence, watching a high-powered corporate litigator completely fall apart. "I want you to read Exhibit C out loud to your mother-in-law," I instructed, pointing to the specific paragraph I had bookmarked with a bright red adhesive tab. "Read the part where the guarantor assumes 100% of all federal tax obligations, penalties, and criminal restitution. Read the exact clause where I am completely indemnified and held harmless from the specific crimes your client committed." Derek swallowed hard. He looked down at the paper. The lobby was dead silent now, save for the heavy, panicked breathing of Beatrice and Preston. Derek opened his mouth, but his throat was too dry to form words. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, swallowed again, and forced himself to look at the text. "The transferee and the guarantor hereby agree to assume 100% of all legal, financial, and civil liabilities." Derek read, his voice reduced to a raspy, trembling whisper. "This includes unrecorded debts, federal tax obligations, penalties, and criminal restitution associated with Apex Innovations, LLC." Beatrice stopped struggling against the security guard. Her face went entirely slack, all the angry color draining away until she looked pale and sickly. Beatrice looked down at her hands, the hands that had just tried to attack me, and began to tremble violently. She was a woman who had spent her entire life judging others based on their zip codes and designer labels. Now she was realizing that she was legally bound to a massive federal fraud scheme. The government was not just going to take her luxury condominium and her retirement accounts, they were going to hold her criminally liable. "What does that mean?" she asked, her voice shaking as she looked wildly from Derek to Preston. "What did he just read?" "It means you signed for his federal crimes, Beatrice." Derek choked out, tears of genuine panic welling in his eyes. He looked at Preston with absolute, unmasked disgust. "I drafted a boilerplate transfer of assets, but Gwen slipped an indemnification clause into the final revision. I did not read the final draft before we signed it. I assumed she was too intimidated to change it." "You did not read the final draft," Preston yelled, suddenly finding his voice. The shock of the IRS raid was temporarily overpowered by his fury at his lawyer. "You are a senior corporate litigator and you let my mother sign a confession to federal wire fraud because you were too arrogant to read the fine print." "Do not put this on me, Preston!" Derek screamed right back at him, all family loyalty instantly disintegrating under the threat of federal prison. "You lied to me. You told me the company was clean. You told me those offshore accounts were legitimate venture capital funds. You used me to launder stolen government money, and now I am going to be disbarred and indicted because of your greed." I stood there and watched the Golden family devour themselves. They were feral, turning on each other the second their stolen wealth was stripped away. The united front they had presented in the courtroom was nothing but a fragile illusion built on lies and stolen federal relief funds. Now that the money was gone, there was nothing left but blame and terror. I stepped forward, commanding their attention one last time. "You both sat in that courtroom and laughed at me," I said, directing my steady gaze between Preston and Derek. "You called me a glorified calculator. You told me I did not understand the complexities of your brilliant business. You were so desperate to strip me of my dignity and throw me out on the street that you rushed the paperwork. You let your massive egos completely blind you to reality. I turned my attention squarely to Preston. He looked utterly broken, a hollow shell of the arrogant man who had proudly bought his mistress a diamond bracelet and mocked me with a $5,000 steakhouse receipt just 2 days ago. He had nothing left. No company, no cars, no money, and soon no freedom. You wanted the whole pie, Preston. I said softly, ensuring the absolute finality of my words sank deep into his bones. Enjoy the poison. The head of building security did not wait for another outburst. He signaled to his team, and 4 large guards immediately surrounded the hysterical remnants of my former family. They firmly grabbed Preston by the arms and corralled Beatrice toward the heavy glass revolving doors. Derek followed behind them like a ghost, his shoulders slumped and his expensive briefcase hanging limply from his trembling hand. I stood perfectly still in the center of the lobby, watching through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows as they were unceremoniously shoved out onto the concrete of the visitor parking lot directly in front of the building. The bright midday sun offered no warmth to the cold reality crashing down upon them. Jillian was waiting for them outside. She was leaning casually against the luxury SUV of her brother, holding 2 large designer shopping bags she had undoubtedly purchased with stolen money just an hour earlier. She saw her mother stumbling out of the building with tears streaming down her face and pushed herself off the car, her brow furrowing in confusion. Before Jillian could even ask what had happened, the fragile alliance of the Hayes family violently detonated. Beatrice whipped around on her high heels. She did not aim her fury at her son, the man who had actually committed the massive financial crimes. Instead, she turned her absolute rage onto the man who was supposed to protect her wealth. She raised her hand and slapped Derek across the face with a force that echoed sharply across the concrete parking lot. "You stupid, incompetent hack!" Beatrice screamed, her voice cracking with a mixture of terror and absolute malice. "You let her legally bind me to a federal crime." The slap was so hard, it knocked the designer sunglasses right off the face of Derek. They clattered onto the pavement and shattered. Derek stood frozen for a fraction of a second, his hand rising to cover the bright red welt blooming on his cheek. He was a high-powered corporate attorney. He was a man who commanded boardrooms and terrified junior partners. He was not a man who allowed anyone, let alone his arrogant mother-in-law, to lay a hand on him. The shock on his face instantly morphed into an explosive, uncontrollable rage. All the polished professionalism he had cultivated for years evaporated into thin air. "Do not you ever touch me!" Derek roared back, his deep voice easily overpowering her shrill screams. He stepped aggressively toward Beatrice, forcing her to stumble backward against the side of the SUV. "I did not bind you to a federal crime, Beatrice. Your own greed did. You were so desperate to kick Gwen out of that house that you gladly signed a blank check for liability." Derek spun around and pointed a shaking finger directly at the chest of Preston. "And you lied to me. You sat in my office, looked me directly in the eye, and told me the company was clean. You told me those SBA loans were fully forgiven and legally acquired. I did what I had to do to build my company." Preston shouted, stepping up to defend his mother, though his voice lacked any real conviction. He looked wildly around the parking lot, realizing people on the sidewalk were stopping to watch the spectacle. "You are my lawyer, Derek. You are supposed to fix this. You are supposed to find the loophole." "There is no loophole for federal money laundering." Derek screamed, the veins pulsing angrily at his temples. "The Internal Revenue Service has the phantom ledgers, Preston. They have the offshore routing numbers." Gwen handed them a fully executed legal document where you assumed total criminal liability and exonerated her completely. "It is over. You are both going to federal prison." The words hit the air like a physical shockwave. Jillian dropped her designer shopping bags. The glossy paper hit the ground, spilling expensive cosmetics and silk scarves onto the dirty concrete. She stared at her husband, her mouth hanging open in absolute horror. "Prison." Jillian gasped, her voice trembling. "Derek, what are you talking about? What about my credit cards? What about our house?" "Everything is frozen, Jillian." Derek snapped, shooting a look of pure disgust at his wife. The feds are seizing the assets. The money is gone. The free ride is officially over. Jillian stared at him for a long moment as the reality of the situation finally penetrated her deep sense of entitlement. She was a woman who had never worked a day in her life. She relied entirely on the wealth of her brother and the income of her husband to fund her luxurious existence. The realization that she was suddenly broke, that her mother was destitute, and that her husband was facing professional ruin caused her to completely break down. She sank to the pavement right next to her spilled shopping bags, buried her face in her hands, and burst into loud, ugly tears. "I am severing my representation immediately," Derek announced, his voice tight and formal despite the chaotic environment. "I am no longer your attorney, Preston. I have to hire my own criminal defense counsel just to keep from being disbarred and indicted alongside you. Do not call my office. Do not call my cell phone. If you try to contact me, I will file a restraining order." Derek turned his back on his weeping wife, his hysterical mother-in-law, and his ruined brother-in-law. He did not even bother to pick up his shattered sunglasses. He marched quickly down the sidewalk, desperately trying to put physical distance between himself and the radioactive fallout of the Hayes family. Preston stood in the parking lot, completely paralyzed. He watched his lawyer walk away. He looked down at his sister wailing on the ground, and his mother leaning against the SUV, gasping for air, as a full-blown panic attack overtook her. The empire he thought he had secured just 3 days ago had been entirely eradicated in less than 10 minutes. He reached a trembling hand up to loosen his expensive silk tie. He needed a plan. He needed to call his wealth manager again, or maybe book a flight out of the country before the federal agents realized he had left the bank. His mind raced through a dozen desperate, impossible scenarios. Suddenly, the sharp ringing of his cell phone pierced the heavy, panicked air. Preston jumped, startled by the noise. He fumbled in his pocket and pulled out the device. He stared at the screen, desperately hoping to see a name that could offer him a lifeline. Instead, the caller ID displayed the front gate security station of his exclusive Highland Park neighborhood. Preston swallowed hard. He swiped the screen and pressed the phone to his ear. "Hello? Mr. Hayes?" The voice of the security guard sounded tense and unnaturally formal. "Sir, I need to inform you that there is a situation at your residence." "What situation?" Preston demanded, his voice cracking. "The U.S. Marshals are here, sir." The guard replied, the sound of heavy diesel engines and static echoing in the background of the call. They arrived with a convoy of moving trucks and a federal seizure warrant for the property. They are currently cutting the locks on your front doors and impounding the vehicles in the garage. They requested that I call you and advise you to surrender yourself to the nearest federal field office immediately. Preston dropped the phone from his ear. His hand was shaking so violently that the device slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the concrete of the parking lot. He did not bother to pick it up. The advice of the security guard to surrender to the nearest federal field office completely evaporated from his mind. Rational thought had been entirely replaced by a primal, blinding panic. He spun around and sprinted toward his luxury SUV, leaving his mother and sister weeping on the pavement behind him. He threw himself into the driver's seat, slammed his foot onto the accelerator, and sped out of the downtown parking garage. He merged onto the highway, recklessly cutting off semi-trucks and ignoring the furious honking of other drivers. His mind was racing through a frantic checklist of survival. He needed to get to the house. He needed to find Kelsey. He still believed he could salvage something. He thought if he could just get to the safe in his home office, grab his expensive watches, and the emergency cash he kept hidden, they could run. He clung to the delusion that he was still the smartest man in the room, but his delusions violently collided with reality the moment he turned onto his exclusive Highland Park street. He slammed on the brakes, his SUV skidding to a halt near the entrance of his driveway. The street was completely blocked. A fleet of unmarked black federal vehicles was parked haphazardly across the pristine landscaping. A massive, heavy-duty flatbed tow truck was idling loudly in front of his house. And resting securely on the back of that flatbed, strapped down by thick, heavy chains, was the gleaming black Porsche Macan that I had signed away just 3 days ago. Preston stared through his windshield in absolute horror. The public humiliation was absolute. Every single wealthy neighbor on the block had stepped out onto their manicured lawns or was peering through their expensive plantation shutters watching the golden boy of the neighborhood get dismantled by the federal government. He threw the SUV into park, leaving the keys in the ignition and the engine running, and sprinted up his long driveway. Two armed United States Marshals, wearing tactical vests, immediately stepped into his path, raising their hands to stop him. Preston frantically held up his hands, gasping for air. "This is my house," he yelled, his voice cracking. "I live here. Let me inside." One of the marshals checked a clipboard, verified his identity, and stepped aside. "You are free to enter to collect personal non-valuable clothing, Mr. Hayes," the marshal stated coldly. "But be advised, this property and all high-value assets within it are currently under federal seizure. Do not attempt to remove anything of significant financial value, or you will be arrested on the spot." Preston pushed past them and stumbled through the massive front doors. The grand foyer, which had been the site of his extravagant victory party less than 48 hours ago, was now an active staging ground for federal agents. Men and women in windbreakers were moving methodically through the house with clipboards and digital cameras. They were slapping bright neon green seizure tags onto everything in sight. The imported Italian marble tables, the custom leather sofas, even the crystal chandelier hanging above his head had a neon tag dangling from it. He ignored the agents and ran frantically up the sweeping mahogany staircase, taking the steps two at a time. He burst into the master suite, desperate to find comfort, desperate to find the woman who had praised his genius just this morning. He found Kelsey in the massive walk-in closet, but she was not crying out of concern for him. She was in full, ruthless survival mode. A massive designer suitcase was thrown open on the floor. Kelsey was moving with frantic energy, ripping expensive silk dresses from their hangers and throwing them into the bag. She was not packing her workout gear. She was aggressively looting the sinking ship. She grabbed a velvet jewelry box from the vanity, dumping the contents into her purse. She was taking the diamond tennis bracelet, the gold necklaces, and the expensive watches that Preston had purchased using the stolen small business relief funds. "Kelsey," Preston gasped, leaning heavily against the doorframe, trying to catch his breath. "What are you doing? The feds are downstairs. We have to get out of here." Kelsey did not even pause. She shoved a pair of red-soled designer heels into the suitcase and zipped it shut with a sharp, violent motion. "I am getting out of here," she corrected him, her voice entirely devoid of the sweet, admiring tone she usually used with him. "You are staying right where you are." Preston stepped into the closet, reaching his hands out toward her in a desperate plea. "Kelsey, baby, listen to me. This is just a massive misunderstanding. Derek is going to fix this. My lawyer is going to file an injunction and sort everything out. I still have the offshore accounts. We can leave the country. We can go to the Bahamas just like we planned. Please just stay with me." Kelsey stopped moving. She stood up straight and looked at Preston. She did not look at him with love or sympathy. She looked at him with cold, calculating disgust. It was the look of a predator realizing her prey had nothing left to offer. "Are you genuinely this stupid?" Kelsey asked, her voice dripping with absolute contempt. "Derek is not going to fix anything. Your sister called me 10 minutes ago screaming that Derek completely severed your representation and abandoned you in a parking lot. Your lawyer quit Preston. You do not have offshore accounts anymore. The government froze everything. You are completely broke." Preston flinched as if she had physically struck him. "But we love each other," he pleaded, his voice breaking into a pathetic whine. "You said you wanted a future with me. You said we were building an empire together." Kelsey let out a sharp, cruel laugh that echoed in the cavernous closet. "I said I wanted a future with a wealthy tech CEO." She snapped, grabbing the handle of her heavy suitcase. "I did not sign up to be the girlfriend of a broke felon. You lied to me about where the money came from. You dragged me into this mess. You are broke and you are going to federal prison. I am 24 years old, Preston. I am absolutely not doing conjugal visits." She brushed past him, her shoulder hitting his chest hard enough to make him stumble backward. Preston tried to grab her arm, but she yanked it away violently. "Do not touch me," she warned, her eyes flashing with genuine malice. Preston stood frozen in the doorway of his closet, entirely stripped of his ego and his pride. He watched the young woman he had destroyed his marriage for drag her heavy suitcase down the hallway. She did not look back. She reached the top of the stairs and began descending into the foyer. A federal agent was in the process of rolling up the massive, expensive Persian rug at the bottom of the steps. Kelsey stepped right over the seized rug without a second glance. She walked out the front doors, her high heels clicking sharply against the concrete. Preston walked slowly to the massive window of the master bedroom and looked down at the street. A black luxury Uber was waiting at the curb. The driver loaded her heavy designer suitcase into the trunk. Kelsey climbed into the back seat, pulled on a pair of dark sunglasses, and the car pulled away, disappearing down the affluent street. Preston Hayes was left standing entirely alone in the echoing foreclosed mansion. His wife was gone. His lawyer had abandoned him. His mother was destitute. His mistress had robbed him and fled. The federal agents continued to swarm the house below him, cataloging the ruins of his stolen empire, while he finally realized that his own arrogance had built the very cage he was now trapped inside. 2 weeks after Preston stood completely alone in his foreclosed mansion, watching his mistress drive away in an Uber, the desperation of the Hayes family reached a boiling point. The federal raid had left them with absolutely nothing. Their bank accounts were frozen solid. Their luxury cars were impounded in a government lot. Their social standing had been entirely eradicated overnight. And yet their sheer arrogance forced them to make one final pathetic attempt to regain control of a narrative that had already destroyed them. I walked back through the heavy oak doors of the family court of Cook County. The contrast between my first visit and this one was staggering. Just 14 days ago, I was sitting at this very mahogany table, flanked by a mother who begged me to surrender my dignity. Today, I walked in with my head held high, radiating absolute calm. Beside me was Richard Caldwell, one of the most ruthless and high-powered federal attorneys in Chicago. I had retained his services immediately after the raid, ensuring my whistleblower immunity and my legal boundaries remained completely ironclad. We took our seats at the defense table. I looked across the aisle and almost did not recognize the people sitting opposite of me. Preston looked completely hollowed out. The glowing tan from his expensive golf trips had faded into a sickly grayish pallor. He was wearing an ill-fitting generic suit that looked like it had been purchased off the rack at a discount store, undoubtedly the only formal clothing the federal agents had not seized. Beatrice was sitting in the spectator gallery behind him, looking 10 years older. Her expensive highlights were fading, exposing harsh gray roots, and she clutched a cheap canvas tote bag instead of her usual designer purse. But it was Derek who looked the most destroyed. He was acting as the legal counsel for Preston, representing him in a frantic emergency motion because absolutely no reputable law firm in the city would touch this radioactive case. Derek looked like a man who had not slept a single hour in 2 weeks. His eyes were bloodshot, his posture was slumped, and his hands trembled slightly as he organized his files. He was fighting for his own professional survival, desperately trying to undo the legal trap he had arrogantly walked right into. The heavy wooden door behind the bench opened, and the same older judge from our original hearing walked into the room. He took his seat, adjusted his glasses, and looked down at the emergency docket with an expression of profound irritation. "Court is in session," the judge announced, his voice echoing sharply. "I am looking at an emergency motion to vacate a finalized divorce settlement. Mr. Hayes, you are representing the petitioner. You claim there was fraud and deceptive practices involved in the execution of... Explain yourself and make it quick. I do not appreciate having finalized agreements dragged back into my courtroom." Derek stood up quickly, leaning heavily on the table for support. "Your Honor, this entire settlement was orchestrated under false pretenses." He began, his voice lacking its usual booming confidence. "The respondent, Gwendolyn Hayes, maliciously concealed an active federal investigation from my client during the divorce negotiations. She knew that Apex Innovations was the target of the Internal Revenue Service. She weaponized this court to seamlessly transfer millions of dollars in federal tax liabilities and criminal restitution onto my client and his mother, Beatrice Hayes. Derek paced nervously in front of his table, sweat beading on his forehead. Exhibit C was a calculated trap, Your Honor. It was a Trojan horse slipped into the final draft of the agreement. She committed fraud by omission. She allowed my client to assume ownership of a company she knew was functionally worthless and federally compromised. We are asking the court to immediately void the divorce settlement, strike Exhibit C from the record, and restore the shared liability to both parties. He was practically begging the judge to throw the federal liabilities back onto my shoulders. He wanted to undo the indemnification clause so he could save his mother-in-law from poverty and save himself from being disbarred as a co-conspirator. I sat perfectly still, letting him exhaust his panicked, desperate narrative. When Derek finally sat down, breathing heavily and wiping his forehead with a crumpled handkerchief, the judge turned his attention to our side of the table. Richard Caldwell stood up slowly. He buttoned his expensive suit jacket, exuding the calm, terrifying authority of a man who dealt with federal indictments on a daily basis. He did not raise his voice. He did not pace. He simply stood tall and dismantled the argument of Derek piece by piece. Your Honor, the claims made by opposing counsel are not only entirely without merit, but they are an insult to the intelligence of this court, Caldwell stated smoothly. Mr. Derek Hayes is a senior corporate litigator. He personally drafted the core framework of this divorce settlement. He sat in this exact room 2 weeks ago and aggressively demanded that his client receive 100% of the equity in Apex Innovations. Caldwell gestured toward the signed documents resting on the bench of the judge. In corporate law, due diligence is the absolute responsibility of the transferee. Mr. Preston Hayes and his counsel were explicitly asked on the record if they accepted all liabilities associated with the company. They enthusiastically agreed. They explicitly waived their right to a discovery period because they were so blinded by their own greed and their desire to leave my client with nothing. You cannot claim fraud when you actively demanded the very asset that ruined you. My client simply gave them exactly what they asked for. Derek leaped out of his chair, slamming his hand on the table. Objection! He shouted, his voice cracking with panic. That is a mischaracterization of the facts. There was no way we could have performed due diligence on phantom ledgers. She kept the illegal Small Business Administration loans completely hidden. She orchestrated this entire scheme silently to frame my client. We had no prior knowledge of the financial crimes. The courtroom fell dead silent. Derek had just backed himself into the exact corner we were waiting for. He had explicitly claimed that Preston was an innocent victim who had no idea the company was committing federal fraud. Richard Caldwell did not even blink. He reached into his sleek leather briefcase and pulled out a digital audio player. He placed it carefully on the edge of our table. He looked directly at Preston, who was now sweating profusely, then at Derek, and finally addressed the judge with absolute icy precision. Your Honor, my client did not hide anything, Caldwell said, his voice ringing with undeniable finality. In fact, she actively tried to stop the financial crimes from occurring before they destroyed her marriage. I formally request to submit Exhibit D into evidence. I have an audio recording from exactly 6 months ago where my client explicitly warned Mr. Hayes about the illegal SBA loans, and he told her to, quote, "shut up and mind your place." The judge stared at the small digital audio player resting on our table. He looked back at Derek, who was completely frozen in place, and then gave Richard Caldwell a sharp nod of permission. Caldwell pressed the silver button on the device. The crisp, high-fidelity audio filled the dead silence of the courtroom. My own voice played first, sounding exhausted and deeply strained. I was pleading with him. Preston, you cannot do this. My recorded voice echoed off the wood-paneled walls. These are federal relief funds. The Small Business Administration is going to audit these accounts eventually. You transferred $3 million into an offshore shell company. That is wire fraud. We could lose everything. A second of static hissed through the speaker before the voice of Preston cut in. It was dripping with the exact same arrogant condescension he had displayed during our entire marriage. Are you genuinely this naive, Gwen? Preston sneered on the recording. "Everyone is taking this money. It is a government handout. I moved it through the Cayman account specifically so the feds cannot trace it. I am building a legacy, and I am not going to let a terrified little bean counter slow me down." My recorded voice trembled slightly as I responded. "I will not sign the quarterly tax filings, Preston. I will not be a party to money laundering." "Then do not sign them." Preston snapped back, his tone turning violently aggressive. "I will forge your signature myself. Just shut up and mind your place. You are a boring middle-class accountant who got lucky enough to marry a visionary. Let me handle the real business. If you ever threaten to expose my accounts again, I will make sure you never see our children." Caldwell reached out and pressed the stop button. The sudden silence in the courtroom was heavier and more suffocating than before. Derek slumped entirely back into his wooden chair. All the bluster, all the aggressive posturing, and all the righteous indignation evaporated from his body in an instant. He stared blankly at the polished table in front of him. He had just stood before a sitting judge and staked his entire professional reputation on the explicit claim that Preston had no prior knowledge of the financial crimes. He had accused me of malicious deception, and in less than 2 minutes, Caldwell had provided undeniable recorded proof that Preston was not only the mastermind of the federal fraud, but that he had actively threatened me to cover it up. Derek knew the legal implications immediately. By presenting a false narrative to the court, he had crossed the line from incompetent counsel to active participant in perjury. His career was unequivocally over. He was going to lose his license to practice law, and he was likely going to share a cell block with his brother-in-law. In the spectator gallery, Beatrice let out a small, pathetic whimper. The recording had stripped away the final layer of her delusion. She could no longer pretend her son was an innocent victim of a vindictive ex-wife. She had just heard him proudly confess to stealing millions of dollars. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking as she wept quietly into her cheap canvas bag. Preston sat at the defense table, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. He looked wildly around the room, desperately searching for a friendly face, an escape route, or a technicality. But there was nothing. He had recorded his own confession and handed it to me on a silver platter. The judge slowly took off his reading glasses and placed them on the bench. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the heavy wood. When he finally spoke, his voice was dangerously low and vibrating with absolute fury. But that fury was not directed at me. "Mr. Hayes," the judge said, locking his piercing gaze directly onto Preston, "you came into my courtroom 2 weeks ago and demanded that your wife surrender every single asset you possessed. You demanded full ownership of a company you knew was built on stolen federal funds. You sat there and allowed your attorney to mock her intelligence, all while you secretly believed you had successfully defrauded the United States government." Preston swallowed hard, a bead of sweat rolling down his pale cheek. "Your Honor, please. Do not interrupt me." The judge roared, his voice suddenly booming like thunder, making both Preston and Derek physically flinch. "You thought you were invincible. And when the federal authorities finally caught up with your massive criminal enterprise, you had the unmitigated audacity to drag your mess back into my courtroom. You filed an emergency motion claiming fraud. You accused your ex-wife of deception. You attempted to use the family court of Cook County to untangle your federal indictments and evade the Internal Revenue Service." The judge shifted his furious glare to Derek. "And you, counselor, you drafted the indemnification clause. You stood in this room and facilitated the transfer of liability. You failed to perform even the most basic level of due diligence, and then you came back here today and attempted to mislead this court regarding the knowledge of your client. It is the most shameful display of legal incompetence I have witnessed in 30 years on the bench." Derek kept his head bowed, unable to meet the eyes of the judge. He looked like a man who was already serving a life sentence. I sat beside Richard Caldwell, keeping my posture perfectly straight and my expression completely neutral. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I did not need to. The justice system was executing my revenge with a precision I could never have achieved on my own. I had simply handed them the rope, and Preston and Derek had eagerly tied the noose around their own necks. The judge picked up his heavy wooden gavel. He looked at the frantic, desperate faces of the men who had tried to destroy me. This court will not be weaponized to shield criminals from the consequences of their own greed. The judge declared, his voice echoing with absolute finality. The finalized divorce decree stands exactly as it was written. The transfer of assets and liabilities is legally binding and entirely enforceable. The judge raised the gavel high into the air and slammed it down onto the sounding block with a sharp, deafening crack that sealed their fate forever. Motion denied. The contract is ironclad. Mr. Hayes, you signed for the liabilities. I suggest you find a good criminal defense attorney. Exactly 1 month passed since the heavy wooden gavel of the judge slammed down in family court. The chaotic, desperate energy of that room now felt like a lifetime ago. I was no longer sitting across from liars, thieves, and arrogant corporate lawyers. Instead, I was sitting in a sleek leather chair inside the highly secure, pristine offices of the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division in downtown Chicago. The room was dead quiet. It smelled faintly of industrial floor wax and fresh coffee. There was no screaming here. There were no manipulative mothers throwing tantrums about country club reputations. There was only the cold, hard, undisputed reality of federal law. Sitting across the polished mahogany conference table from me was Special Agent Miller, the man who had orchestrated the early morning raid on the Highland Park mansion. He looked tired but deeply satisfied, like a man who had just successfully completed a massive, complex puzzle. He opened a thick manila folder and began laying out the final devastating results of the financial investigation. The forensic evidence I had provided on that encrypted hard drive was absolutely flawless. My meticulous bookkeeping had given the federal government a perfect illuminated roadmap to dismantle the fraudulent empire of Preston Hayes. Agent Miller explained that the raid was a total success. The agents did not just freeze the bank accounts. They seized absolutely everything with a financial pulse. Because I had taken that photograph of the open laptop showing the active money laundering transfer on the kitchen island, the cyber division was able to intercept the digital funds before they disappeared into the offshore crypto wallets. They recovered the entire $3 million of stolen Small Business Administration relief loans. They tracked every single fraudulent wire transfer, every fake vendor invoice, and every offshore routing number. But the federal government did not stop there. Agent Miller leaned forward, clasping his hands on the table, and explained the absolute financial ruin of my former family. Once the forensic accounting team began digging into the corporate ledgers, they found years of deliberate, systematic tax evasion. Preston had been writing off luxury vacations to St. Bart's expensive diamond jewelry for Kelsey and personal luxury vehicles as corporate consulting expenses. The IRS levied massive penalties, fines, and back taxes against Apex Innovations. And because Beatrice Hayes had so arrogantly signed her name as the guarantor on the divorce settlement, she was legally held responsible for those massive corporate penalties. Agent Miller confirmed that the federal government completely liquidated her luxury condominium. They drained her extensive investment portfolios. They seized her retirement accounts and auctioned off her designer assets to cover the massive debts her son had accumulated. Her desperate desire to kick me out of the family had resulted in her absolute financial destruction. In total, Agent Miller stated, looking directly into my eyes, the federal government successfully recovered exactly $4 million in stolen funds, unpaid taxes, and criminal penalties. I sat quietly processing the massive numbers. It was a complete financial annihilation of the Hayes family. They were entirely wiped out. They had nothing left but the generic clothes on their backs and the impending federal indictments hanging over their heads. Agent Miller closed the heavy file and reached into his tailored suit jacket. He pulled out a crisp official Treasury document and placed it on the table in front of me. Ms. Hayes, Agent Miller said, his voice filled with genuine professional respect. The United States government heavily incentivizes citizens who expose massive financial fraud. We rely on brilliant insiders who are willing to come forward with actionable, undeniable evidence. You did not just give us an anonymous tip. You handed us a fully prosecuted case tied up with a neat little bow. You also cleverly ensured that you were completely legally severed and fully immunized before our agents even walked through the front door. He tapped the official document on the table with his index finger. Under the federal whistleblower program, an informant whose evidence leads to the direct recovery of stolen government funds is entitled to a mandatory bounty. The law dictates that the whistleblower must receive between 15 and 30% of the total recovered amount. Agent Miller opened a smaller envelope resting on top of the file. Because your evidence resulted in the swift, undeniable, and complete recovery of $4 million, the Treasury Department has approved a payout at the baseline of 15%. He slid a rectangular piece of heavy watermarked paper across the polished mahogany table. I looked down at it. It was a physical check issued directly by the United States Treasury. My name, Gwendolyn Hayes, was printed neatly across the center in dark black ink, and right next to my name was the payout amount. $600,000. I stared at the numbers printed on the check. $600,000. It was completely tax-free, perfectly legal, and entirely mine. It was more money than Preston had ever actually earned through legitimate hard work in his entire life. He had to lie, manipulate, cheat, and commit massive federal crimes just to pretend he had this kind of wealth. He destroyed his marriage and ruined his own family for a temporary illusion of power. I simply had to read the fine print, tell the truth, and wait for the math to catch up to his staggering arrogance. "You earned this, Ms. Hayes," Agent Miller said softly, offering me a silver pen to sign the final disclosure and receipt forms. "You protected yourself, you protected your children, and you did a massive service to the American taxpayers. You are officially cleared of any and all association with Apex Innovations. You are a completely free woman." I picked up the pen and signed my name on the final government form with sharp, steady strokes. I did not feel a rush of manic excitement. I did not feel the desperate need to throw a lavish party or buy an expensive sports car to show off to my neighbors. I just felt an overwhelming, profound sense of peace. The heavy toxic burden I had carried for the last 9 months was finally gone. I carefully folded the treasury check and placed it into the inner zippered pocket of my structured leather tote bag. I stood up, shook the hand of Agent Miller firmly, and thanked him for his diligent work on the case. I walked out of the secure conference room, rode the silent elevator down to the lobby, and pushed through the heavy glass revolving doors of the massive federal building. I stepped out onto the busy Chicago sidewalk. The afternoon sun broke through the gray clouds, hitting my face with a bright, warm glow. The crisp wind blowing off Lake Michigan rustled my hair and filled my lungs. I took a deep, grounding breath of the fresh city air. I was 33 years old. I was a highly respected certified fraud examiner. I had full, undisputed custody of my 2 beautiful children. I had entirely cut out the toxic weight of my ex-husband, my cruel mother-in-law, and my own manipulative mother. And I had a perfectly legal government check for $600,000 sitting securely in my bag. As I walked down the street surrounded by the bustling energy of the city, I realized I was not just a survivor of a toxic marriage. I was completely, undeniably, and permanently financially secure. I walked a few blocks away from the federal building and stepped inside a quiet artisan coffee shop. The rich aroma of freshly roasted espresso beans wrapped around me. I walked up to the counter and ordered a complicated, expensive latte and a warm pastry. For the first time in my adult life, I did not mentally calculate the balance of my checking account before handing over my card. I paid with a simple tap of my phone, left a generous tip for the barista, and found a comfortable seat at a high wooden table near the back of the shop. Mounted on the brick wall directly across from my table was a large flat-screen television. It was tuned to the local Chicago news network with the volume turned up just enough to be heard over the low hum of the espresso machines. I took a slow sip of my coffee, savoring the rich flavor when the regular broadcast was suddenly interrupted by a bright red breaking news graphic. The camera cut to an anchor sitting at the news desk, looking incredibly serious. "Good afternoon, Chicago," the anchor announced smoothly. "We have breaking developments in a massive federal fraud investigation that has rocked the affluent Highland Park community. Earlier today, the disgraced founder of a local technology firm was taken into federal custody following a sweeping raid by the Internal Revenue Service and the United States Marshals. The screen transitioned from the polished news studio to raw, shaky footage recorded from a news helicopter hovering over a cheap, dilapidated motel on the far outskirts of the city. It was the kind of establishment that charged by the hour, featuring a flickering neon sign and a parking lot littered with trash. The camera zoomed in on the door of room number 12. Two burly federal agents pushed the door open and escorted a man out into the harsh daylight. It was Preston, the wealthy visionary CEO who had mocked my discount suits and bragged about his $5,000 steakhouse lunches, was now wearing a stained gray t-shirt and wrinkled sweatpants. His hands were securely fastened behind his back in heavy steel handcuffs. He looked absolutely pathetic. His hair was greasy and unkempt, and he desperately tried to duck his head to hide his face from the swarm of local news cameras waiting at the edge of the parking lot. The voice of the anchor continued over the humiliating footage. Preston Hayes, 35, has been indicted by a federal grand jury on 12 felony counts, including wire fraud, bank fraud, and aggravated tax evasion. Authorities confirm that Hayes orchestrated a complex scheme to illegally obtain $3 million in federal pandemic relief funds, which he subsequently laundered through offshore accounts to finance a lavish personal lifestyle. I watched Preston stumble awkwardly as an agent placed a hand on his head and guided him into the back of a heavily armored federal transport vehicle. The heavy metal doors slammed shut, locking him inside his new reality. He was facing decades in federal prison. But the news broadcast was not finished. The Golden family had operated as a unit, and they were falling as a unit. The broadcast cut to a live reporter standing on a busy downtown sidewalk. Directly behind the reporter was the towering luxury high-rise condominium building where Beatrice had lived for the past 10 years. The building was known for its strict security, exclusive residence, and exorbitant association fees. The fallout from the Hayes indictment has triggered massive collateral damage for his family members. The reporter stated, gesturing toward the entrance of the building. Federal authorities have executed a rare civil asset forfeiture against Beatrice Hayes, the mother of the disgraced CEO who legally guaranteed the fraudulent corporate entity. Her extensive investment portfolios and retirement accounts were entirely liquidated this morning to repay the stolen government funds. The news station played a recorded clip from earlier in the day. The polished glass doors of the luxury building slid open, and Beatrice was forcefully escorted out by building security. She was no longer wearing her expensive silk blouses or her designer heels. She was wearing a mismatched velour tracksuit. Beatrice looked completely unhinged. She saw the news cameras and immediately lunged toward them, her face twisted in absolute fury. "This is a mistake!" Beatrice screamed at the reporters, frantically waving her arms. "I am a wealthy woman. I belong in this building. You cannot do this to me." A security guard stepped in front of the camera, blocking her path. Behind Beatrice, a team of professional movers was dumping her personal belongings onto the dirty concrete sidewalk in cheap, mismatched cardboard boxes. Jillian was standing next to the pile of boxes, looking utterly miserable. Jillian was trying to shove the heavy cardboard boxes into the trunk of a small, heavily dented sedan. The luxury SUV of her husband had been seized days ago. The reporter concluded the segment with a final devastating detail. Beatrice Hayes has been officially evicted from the premises and is reportedly relocating to the cramped two-bedroom apartment of her daughter in the suburbs. The image of Beatrice, the woman who had spent decades looking down her nose at everyone around her, screaming on a public sidewalk, while her unemployed daughter loaded her garbage bags into a beat-up car, was a masterpiece of poetic justice. She had demanded that I give them everything, and in doing so she had lost everything she valued in this world. The screen flashed back to the news anchor at the desk. In a final development regarding this ongoing scandal, the state legal community has taken swift action against the corporate attorney who facilitated the fraudulent transfer of assets. The State Ethics Committee held an emergency hearing this morning and has officially and permanently disbarred Derek Hayes. His former prestigious law firm released a statement severing all ties and condemning his actions. Legal experts speculate that Derek Hayes may soon face his own conspiracy charges. I watched the news program transition to a commercial break. The broadcast was over. The Hayes family had been entirely dismantled by their own greed. They had tried to build an empire on a foundation of lies, manipulation, and stolen money. Now they were nothing more than a cautionary tale broadcasted to millions of people during the lunch hour. I took another sip of my latte. It tasted absolutely perfect. I looked out the window of the coffee shop at the busy city street, feeling the weightless freedom of a woman who had finally won the war. 3 weeks after watching the spectacular televised downfall of my former in-laws, the physical reality of my new life finally took shape. I stood in the driveway of a beautiful, newly constructed 4-bedroom house in one of the top-tier school districts in the state. It had a sprawling green lawn, mature oak trees framing the property, and a wide front porch that practically begged for a porch swing and a quiet cup of morning coffee. There was no imported Italian marble. There were no absurd crystal chandeliers paid for with stolen federal relief funds. Every single brick, every pane of glass, and every blade of grass belonged entirely to me, purchased cleanly and legally with the whistleblower bounty I had earned. The moving truck was backed into the driveway, and a team of professional movers was carefully carrying boxes into the spacious foyer. My children were already in the backyard laughing and running around the massive wooden play structure I had ordered for them. For the first time in years, the air around me felt incredibly light. I did not have to constantly audit my own behavior. I did not have to shrink myself to accommodate the massive, fragile ego of a narcissistic husband or endure the endless passive-aggressive criticisms of a snobbish mother-in-law. I was finally breathing my own air, I was checking off boxes on a clipboard when the familiar sound of tires crunching on gravel broke my concentration. I looked up from my inventory list. A silver sedan pulled up to the curb and parked right behind the moving truck. The driver's side door opened, and my mother stepped out onto the pristine suburban street. Martha had clearly made an effort to look perfectly put together. She was wearing a tailored navy blouse, her hair was freshly styled, and she was carrying a designer handbag. But as she walked up the driveway toward me, the cracks in her polished facade were glaringly obvious. Her smile was far too wide, stretching tightly across her face in a display of forced, frantic warmth. Her eyes darted nervously around the property, taking in the expensive neighborhood, the pristine landscaping, and the clear evidence of my absolute financial independence. "Gwen, darling," Martha called out, her voice dripping with an artificial sweetness that instantly made my skin crawl. She practically jogged the last few steps and threw her arms open, attempting to pull me into a tight embrace. I did not step forward to meet her. I simply lowered my clipboard and held my ground, forcing her to awkwardly drop her arms to her sides. "You did not tell me you were moving today," Martha said quickly, recovering her composure and waving her hand toward the beautiful house. "Oh my goodness, Gwen, this place is absolutely spectacular. I looked up the property values in this neighborhood on my way over here. You really outdid yourself. It is so much more elegant than that gaudy mansion Preston bought." I always said Beatrice had terrible taste in architecture. I stared at her, marveling at the sheer unadulterated audacity of the woman standing in front of me. The last time I had seen my mother, she was screaming at me in the hallway of her apartment building. She had called me a failure. She had accused me of ruining her social reputation. She had explicitly told me that if I walked out her door without begging Preston for forgiveness, I would have no family. Yet here she was, standing in my new driveway, acting as if we were best friends, catching up over brunch. "How did you find this address, Mother?" I asked, my voice completely devoid of the warmth she was so desperately trying to manufacture. Martha waved her hand dismissively, letting out a breathy little laugh. "Oh, you know me. I still have a few friends at the real estate agency. When I heard you bought a place in this zip code, I just had to come see it for myself. I am so incredibly proud of you, Gwen. I really am. I always knew you were the smart one. I always knew you would come out on top." She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a tissue, dabbing delicately at the corners of her eyes. The crocodile tears flowed right on cue. It has been such a stressful month for me, Gwen. You have no idea what it has been like. When the news broke about Preston and that massive federal indictment, my phone was ringing off the hook. All the women at the country club were asking me questions. It was a complete nightmare. But I stood my ground. I told them all that my daughter was a brilliant forensic accountant who exposed a massive criminal enterprise. I told them you were a hero. I listened to her attempt to rewrite history with a detached clinical fascination. She was a master of emotional manipulation, seamlessly pivoting from being my harshest critic to my biggest fan the exact moment my net worth skyrocketed. She did not care about my safety. She did not care about the emotional trauma my children and I had endured. She only cared that she could now use my success as a shield to protect her precious social standing. That is a very creative version of events, I said smoothly, not breaking eye contact. The last time we spoke, you demanded I tolerate his mistress and beg for my job back. You called me a selfish coward. Martha flinched, the artificial smile faltering for a split second before she hastily pinned it back into place. I was just worried about you, sweetie. She insisted, stepping closer and lowering her voice into a conspiratorial whisper. Mothers worry. I was terrified you were going to end up with nothing. But you played the game perfectly. You secured the whistleblower money. You are rich, Gwen. You are richer than Preston ever was, and yours is actually legal. She paused, taking a deep breath, finally maneuvering toward the actual reason she had tracked me down, which is why I am here. Since Preston is in jail and Beatrice is completely broke, that entire side of our social circle is falling apart. I have had to carry the financial burden of keeping up appearances all by myself. My credit cards are completely maxed out, Gwen. The interest rates are killing me. I was hoping since you just received that massive government payout you could help your mother out. Just a small loan to pay off my balances. We are family after all. We have to stick together now that the dust has settled. She looked at me with wide, pleading eyes, fully expecting the obedient, anxious daughter she had controlled for 3 decades to simply pull out a checkbook and buy her love. She expected me to fund her empty, status-obsessed lifestyle just to keep the peace. I looked at my mother with absolute zero emotion. I did not feel angry. I did not feel sad. I just felt a profound sense of finality. I am a single mother protecting her peace. I said, my voice dropping to a cold, razor-sharp register that cut right through her manipulative performance. You chose the thieves. Go ask Beatrice for money. I did not wait for her to respond. I turned my back on her, walked up the concrete steps of my beautiful new front porch, stepped inside my house and firmly locked the heavy front door behind me. I stood in the quiet entryway for a long moment, listening to the heavy deadbolt click into place. The sound was a physical barrier between my past and my future. For the first time in my entire life, I did not feel a single shred of guilt for shutting my mother out. I did not rush to the window to see if she was crying on the front porch. I did not unlock the door to offer her a compromise or a small check to soothe her fragile ego. I simply turned around and walked away, leaving her to face the reality of the choices she had made. I walked up the freshly carpeted stairs to the second floor, the soft padding muffling my footsteps. The afternoon sun was streaming through the large hallway windows, casting warm golden squares across the pristine hardwood. I pushed open the door to the room belonging to my daughter. It was painted a soft, cheerful yellow, entirely unlike the cold, sterile designer gray Beatrice had insisted upon for the nursery in Highland Park. Boxes were stacked neatly in the corner, but her bed was already assembled, covered in her favorite brightly colored quilt. Across the hall, the room of my son was a canvas of deep ocean blue, filled with the toys and books that Preston had always deemed too messy for his pristine vision of a home. I spent the next 2 hours unpacking their clothes, arranging their favorite stories on the bookshelves, and hanging their colorful drawings on the walls. There was no pretentious interior designer dictating the aesthetic of their childhood. There was only warmth, comfort, and the undeniable presence of love. As I smoothed the sheets on the bed of my son, I realized something profound was missing from my body. The constant gnawing anxiety that usually buzzed at the base of my neck was entirely gone. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. The screen was completely blank. The phantom vibrations that used to plague me were gone. There were no frantic text messages from Preston demanding I manage his chaotic schedule. There were no passive-aggressive voicemails from Beatrice critiquing my parenting or my wardrobe. There were no manipulative guilt trips from Martha begging for money or social validation. Before I had moved into this house, I had gone into my cellular provider account and completely changed my phone number. I did not forward the new digits to anyone except my closest friends, the school of my children, and my federal attorney. The silence radiating from the device was not empty. It was the rich, heavy silence of absolute peace. I placed the phone on a bedside table and smiled. The fortress was completely secure. I walked downstairs and headed toward the back of the house where a beautiful sunlit room had been designated as my home office. A large oak desk sat in the center of the room, completely clear of clutter. I sat down in my ergonomic chair and opened my laptop. For years, opening a computer in my own home meant bracing myself for disaster. It meant hunting down fraudulent wire transfers covering the tracks of an arrogant thief and working myself to the bone to build an empire that I was never allowed to claim. But today was different. I did not open a spreadsheet filled with stolen federal loans. I opened the digital portfolio for my newly incorporated business. I had dropped the last name of Preston the moment the ink dried on the divorce papers, returning to my maiden name. In the 4 weeks since the federal raid on Apex Innovations, the professional reputation of my independent forensic accounting firm had exploded. Word travels fast in the financial district of Chicago. Corporate boards and legitimate tech startups were scrambling to hire the auditor who had single-handedly dismantled a multi-million-dollar federal fraud ring without leaving a single fingerprint. My inbox was flooded with lucrative, legitimate contract offers from executives who actually respected my intelligence. I was no longer a glorified calculator, hiding in the shadow of a fake visionary. I was the chief executive officer of my own firm. I had full, undisputed legal and physical custody of my children. I owned a gorgeous home outright with zero debt. I possessed absolute, unadulterated freedom. The sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky outside my office window in brilliant strokes of orange and violet. I closed my laptop, the soft click echoing satisfyingly in the quiet room. I walked into my spacious modern kitchen and opened the stainless steel refrigerator. I pulled out a chilled bottle of crisp white wine. It was not the outrageously expensive vintage Jillian used to steal from my cellar, but a simple, elegant bottle I had picked out myself simply because I liked the label. I poured a glass, the pale liquid catching the soft light of the kitchen pendants. I carried the wine glass out the back door and stepped onto my wide, custom-built deck. The evening air was cool and refreshing. Down in the sprawling, securely fenced backyard, my son and daughter were chasing each other through the thick green grass, their laughter ringing out clear and bright. They were safe. They were happy. They were completely insulated from the toxic wreckage of the family that had tried to throw us away. I leaned against the sturdy wooden railing, taking a slow sip of the wine. The taste was sharp, sweet, and entirely perfect. I watched my children play as the first stars began to appear in the twilight sky. I thought about that cold, sterile courtroom. I thought about Derek sliding that massive stack of papers across the mahogany table with a predatory smirk. I thought about Beatrice laughing maliciously from the gallery and Preston checking his gold Rolex, so eager to rush back to his mistress and his stolen money. They laughed when I signed away the company. They thought a piece of paper made them kings. But they forgot one thing. I read the fine print. And in the real world, the math always catches up to you. The most profound lesson from Gwen's journey is that true power lies in quiet preparation, not loud arrogance. While her toxic in-laws relied on intimidation and superficial wealth, Gwen used her meticulous knowledge and unshakable boundaries to protect her future. She didn't scream or beg. She let their own unchecked greed orchestrate their downfall. This story reminds us that maintaining our emotional integrity and paying attention to the fine print in life is our greatest armor against manipulation. Take a stand for your own peace today, and share a time you set a difficult boundary in the comments below.